This whole day, quite honestly, is really two things. One, it is asking God for mercy to be able to have these conversations in a way that honestly does deepen, facilitate, and even enable us around these deep issues of reconciliation. The other thing that I think about is that if we're going to be in any way involved at any substantive level in our congregations or communities, this does come up. And to be willing to speak up and to care for people in the midst of those kinds of places of disagreement is really important. And notice I said both speak up and care for people. Because places where we oppose does not mean we don't love. So that's the kind of binary stuff we're actually trying to get rid of, God being our helper. So I'm very, very pleased for us to join together in this time of real, honest prayer, reflection, conversation, and presentations from Dr. Catherine Meeks, who I'm very, very glad could be here with us. So my appreciation to Chris Brathwaite and the anti-racism team for putting this together. So with all of that in mind, let us pray together. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Almighty God, we have no power in ourselves to help ourselves. And so we ask that you would send your good Spirit here to do the very thing that Jesus promised, that he would guide us into all truth. And that you would give us the capacity, O Lord, in your mercy, to hear, to receive, to respond, and do so in a way that fosters the very call that we have been given to be agents of reconciliation. So we thank you. We thank you for the leadership of our presiding bishop who's called us to this. We thank you for the deep roots that is found in the gospel, to be men and women who serve and reflect a kingdom where there is no Jew nor Greek, no male, no female, no slave, no free. So help us, O Lord, by your mercies. And we thank you that you do and that you love us very, very deeply. We commit ourselves and each other into your hands. And may the grace and blessing of God Almighty, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit be with us all and remain with us always. Amen.
Thank you, Bishop. Earlier this year, the bishop asked members of the Anti-Racism Commission to please attend a conference in Atlanta at the Absalom Jones Center for Racial Healing. Some of us got snowed in, and some of us got snowed out. Genevieve and I, we left a little early, and after we got there, we understand that the airport was closed. So those who chose to fly didn't get to come. But Genevieve and I, we got a chance to meet Dr. Meeks and her team, and it was inspirational. So when we came back, we wrote to the bishop, and we told him what we observed and what we learned. And we thought that if he can make this happen, to invite Dr. Meeks to come to speak to the rest of us, it would be a good thing. So today she's here. A couple of things before we get going is that this event is going to be filmed. So I don't know if there's any disclosures, but the recorder and equipment is in the back, and it will be filmed for those who cannot make it to come. Another thing I may say is that Dr. Meeks may be speaking to us one-on-one a little later in the program before I dash her off to the airport. So please join the anti-racism team and your chair in welcoming Dr. Meeks.
Thank you. It is good to be with you. I bring you greetings from the Diocese of Atlanta. from Bishop Rob Wright, and Bishop Wright likes to say that we are a diocese of 56,000 men, women, children, and feisty seniors, and I'm one of the feisty seniors. And I also want you to know that the reason why I sit when I speak is because I have rheumatoid arthritis. And rheumatoid arthritis has been one of my greatest teachers. It has taught me to be a much better caretaker of myself. It's also taught me to be a person who has greater humility. It's taught me a lot about being willing to be served, because we who get so into serving others sometimes forget how to be served. And it's very important, I think, to remember that. And so I've learned a lot. As a matter of fact, I say that rheumatoid arthritis has become one of my greatest teachers. I've learned, since I've been having to sit a lot to speak, that actually that's the way Jesus did a lot. Jesus sat a lot talking. And so when I realized that, I thought I was in pretty good company. So I want to just, if you didn't read a description of today, I want to read just a little bit of a description, just so you kind of have a sense about where we are headed. The title of today, when I wrote the proposal to Father Chris to give to the bishop, is Finding the Face of God in Everyone, Dismantling Inner and Outer Oppressors Who Hinder the Creation of Beloved Community. Finding the Face of God in Everyone, Dismantling Inner and Outer Oppressors Who Hinder the Creation of Beloved Community. We are called to see the face of God in each other and to work each day to create the space where the beloved community can be born of God's Spirit. But the cultural dynamics about race and ethnicity that shape our lives make it difficult for us to see God's face in one another, because we are taught to construct borders based on difference. And today we want to talk about the inner and outer construction of those borders and how that work has hindered the work of beloved community, particularly as they've been used, that border constructing has been used to create the foundation for institutionalized systems of oppression. And I just want to make sure that we stay on the same page today. And I don't know exactly what your expectations might be for this day. I know that you are clergy and lay people in the room. I know that you've been requested to be here by your bishop. So I hope that whatever things you have around all of that you can somehow let go of. And let's try to be here together and see what God might have to say to us. Because in many, many ways, all of us are in the same boat when it comes to having these places in ourselves that hang us up and cause us not to be able to do the things that God has asked us to do. So we talk a lot about what we want to have, like beloved community. We want to have racial reconciliation. But we don't spend enough time, I don't think, talking about what's the inner dynamic that's going on with us that makes it so difficult for us to do the thing we're supposed to be doing. You know, it's like telling people to be forgiving. We're always talking about being forgiving, but we don't tell people how to do it. We expect you, it's like magic. You're just supposed to know, and obviously people don't know because we don't do it. We talk about reconciliation, which is a word I don't use very much because reconciliation implies a prior relationship. And when it comes to race, particularly between, actually most people of color in this country and white people, there's nothing to reconcile because there's never been a relationship that was built on equity and a true sense of equality. So I like to talk more about racial healing than reconciliation. But we talk about this stuff without talking about what's the steps, what's the particulars, how do we get here, and how do we get from where we are to where we need to go. I have a poet, David White, whom I love dearly, and some of you may know him, and one of his poems talks about doing the first thing first. Do the first thing first, which is such a simple instruction, but so complicated, because many times when we have chores in front of us, instead of just getting up and going to do the first thing first, we spend a lot of time lamenting about the third or the fourth or the fifth or the sixth thing that needs to be done. And it keeps us procrastinating so we don't ever really get to the first thing, right? Does that sound familiar to any of you? So what is the first thing first if we want to talk about racial healing and want to talk about really beginning to deconstruct some of the obstructions that we put in the way so that we can't really have space for the beloved community to be created? So one of the things I think is that inside of every human being, there is some capacity to build up barriers and borders, and we are socialized in those ways. We are taught stuff about difference, and we get many different kinds of messages as we go along. So I want to read a little piece of scripture to you from Galatians 3, 26, 28. We have these little scripture cards that we give out when we do dismantling racism trainings in the Diocese of Atlanta. And this is kind of our little mantra card. And we ask people to put this scripture on their refrigerator and to remember it and to internalize it and to recite it to themselves. And it says, "You're all children of God through faith in Christ Jesus. For all of you who were baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you're all one in Christ Jesus." And we ask people to put this where they can see it and remember it. So I want you to hold that in your mind. Also want you to hold the idea that the Lord is our shepherd and we shall not be in want, which means that we don't have to be afraid. We can go on whatever journey we've been called to go on because we've got this wonderful promise that God is going to be there with us. And then I want to ask you if you agree with me that there is one God who made all people. So if there is one God who has created everybody, if there is no slave nor free in Jesus, and the Lord is our shepherd, we don't have much ground to stand on for the differences that we've constructed. We act as if there are many gods and that some people have been created by some of those other gods over there. That's how we act in the world, actually. We act as if, there's some of us that are made by the God, and then there's some of us made by somebody else. And all of us, we can kind of chuckle about this notion, but all of us have got some others in our consciousness that we need to work on. We have somebody that we put in that category over there that wasn't quite made by the same God that made me. And actually, I have a list of them that I want God to send somewhere. The people that you don't want to really be bothered with. We have to. If we want to be set free, we have to start by being honest. That whole notion of the truth will set you free. But first of all, you have to be willing to engage. You have to find out what the truth is, first of all. And second of all, you have to be willing to engage it when you do find out. And so we say all these words. We have so many wonderful words. But I guess I'm now at age 72, ready to say, whatever the words are that we're using, let's make sure they mean something to us. If, there's I think it's actually, I discovered the other day, there was actually Gandhi who said that if silence cannot be improved by the words that you speak, then remain silent. And I think that if I want to say that if I'm speaking words that I can't really embrace as the truth for myself, then I need to also be silent. Because if we paid more attention to these kinds of things, we would be better off. We talk too much and we say too little when we're talking. And I mean all of us, not just me included. So I'm learning many, many times when there's stuff I could say, but being quiet is just a better choice. Now, there are many times when we need to speak up and we are quiet, and that's a different kind of issue. But paying attention, I think, and being conscious is mostly what I'm talking about. I'm framing what I want to say with Galatians, with the Psalm scripture, with the notion that there is one God who's made us all, and God doesn't make hierarchies. God is not a God of hierarchy. God is not a God of hierarchy. So the priest, the bishop, the king, the whoever, the whatever constructions we have made don't have anything to do with God. We made it up. But we live as if it got sent to us in some kind of edict from God Almighty. And we mess ourselves up, so men are a little better than women, women and men are a little better than children. People with in these categories, we have all that stuff in our heads because we have a culture that constructed all this stuff. And then we bought it. We bought the constructions. And now our lifetime work is to, first of all, understand what the constructions are that we bought, and then to begin the long, hard journey of deconstructing them. That's the work. That's the work. It's the healing work. And everybody has to do it. And we have some categories that we labeled with race, and some with gender, and some with class, and some with ordained or not ordained. I mean, some with parish administrator or priest. I mean, we've just got a long list of them. And if we think about that God of creation who doesn't recognize any of them. But we mostly don't believe that. Because if we really and truly believed it, way down at the core of ourselves, we wouldn't even be here today. There would be no need to be here because we would be doing exactly what we're supposed to do. If people who call themselves people of faith had really believed that all the time, we never would have had the mess we've had in this country around difference either. We would not have massacred Indians. We would not have had slavery. We would not have had to do women's suffrage and all that stuff because we would have been doing what we were supposed to. So we don't believe it. And in the 21st century, we still don't believe it. It's part of our job is to pray, God, help me believe that you are the one God who does not have hierarchies. And nobody is any better than anybody else. I get to sit here with my PhD from Emory and my being an author and having the audacity to consider myself capable of coming to speak to a big group of people like this, and I'm no different from the woman who got up under the bridge this morning. Because God looks at us both and loves us both, and God doesn't want her to be under the bridge. And I'm not any better just because for some reason I was able to make better, or not necessarily better, but different choices that led me somewhere else. So may we be humbled in the face of that understanding that God looks at us and sees us all alike. Now, I really believe that, and I try to live that, but I don't like it because I want to be better. I can think of a half a dozen folks that I think I'm a little better than. I'm nicer, I'm kinder, I'm more compassionate, I'm conscious, I'm more conscious. But then, remember Idi Amin, the dictator who killed his own people? Once I was driving somewhere and it hit me that God loved him as much as me. And I had to stop my car. Because I just was so dumbfounded by just thinking that, because I didn't want him to be loved. But that's the point, so that gets me out of my little ego stuff and my little believing that I'm somehow a little better than, because that little better than stuff really gets us. It really does. So I want to invite John O'Donohue into this conversation, and I'm reading from his book, to bless the space between us. And this is called A Morning Offering. And I'm going to read the whole poem, but the last two stanzas are the ones that I really want us to think about a lot this morning. So I bless the night that nourished my heart, to set the ghost of longing free into the flow and figure of dream that went to harvest from the dark, bread for the hunger that no one sees. All that is eternal in me welcomes the wonder of this day, the field of brightness it creates, offering time for each thing to arise and illuminate. I place on the altar of dawn the quiet loyalty of breath, the tent of thought where I shelter waves of desire I am sure to, and all beauty drawn to the eye. And then these two stanzas are the main ones I want you to really think about. May my mind come alive today to the invisible geography that invites me to new frontiers, to break the dead shell of yesterdays, to risk being disturbed and changed. And may I have the courage today to live the life that I would love, to postpone my dream no longer, but to do at last what I came here for, and waste my heart on fear no more. May my mind come alive today to the invisible geography that invites me to new frontiers, to break the dead shell of yesterdays, to risk being disturbed and changed. May I have the courage today to live the life that I would love, to postpone my dream no longer, but do at last what I came here for, and waste my heart on fear no more. At the present moment in our country, we are wasting our hearts too much on fear. And the scripture is so full of the admonition not to fear. Be not afraid, not to fear. God's not given us a spirit of fear, but of power. And so we who are people of faith have got to get a grip. We've got to get a grip, because we are wasting our hearts and wasting ourselves in ways that I don't think please God too much, because God wasn't intending for us to be a people of fear. So I want to now ask you to think a little bit about how fear is constructed, because fear is not just something that you're born with. You know, little babies are pretty much trusting and don't have any reason to believe that they're not going to get what they need until somebody starts not giving them what they need. So all of us have grown up with, in whatever places we've grown up, with our particular parents, and we had nothing to do with that. We were born where we were born, we had nothing to do with it. And sometimes when I'm talking to white people and they talk about feeling bad because they got privilege and they're white, and I want to say, so what do you plan to do about it? You're going to go back and come back green? Or are you going to quit being white? How are you going to work that out? And so the most important thing to do is to be grateful that we got here the way we are. We are here, and we are who we are. And there is not a thing we can do about that except that allow God to improve up on us and to make us authentically who God meant for us to be when we got sent here. So we heard stories, things were told to us, we picked up stuff. There is some new research that talks about maybe some of the stuff kind of followed us through our cellular structure. You know, I don't know much about all of that, but I kind of believe it's possible, you know, that we kind of like a DNA thing, that maybe some stuff got transferred to us that way, perhaps. I haven't looked into that a whole lot, so I don't want to say a whole lot about that, but I do want to say that there is that scripture that talks about the sins of the fathers visiting the sons, and I wonder how that looks, because we are living a lot of stuff that's rooted in our history that we haven't dealt with, that seems to keep on informing us in ways that, or really messing us up in ways sometimes that surprise us. So, but that's neither here nor there. It's not so important to even try to understand the entire process of how we got to where we are as it is to understand that we did get there. We heard stories, we were told things, People said things. We picked up stuff. Some of it just came to us. We went to school. We learned some more stuff. There are all these narratives that fed into helping to make us who we are. And sometimes we have learned a few things that maybe don't work too well for us. I learned to be very, 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 very afraid of the weather in Arkansas, growing up with parents who got us up in the middle of the night when a big thunderstorm came up because it might be a tornado and we might get blown away. I don't actually know why it matters if you get blown away in your jeans or your nightgown, because you'll be dead anyway. But they were really worried about that. And so what they taught me was that I should worry about the weather. And I was laughing about that with my son on the way to the airport because there was some dark clouds coming up. And I was thinking how much fear I always had about dark clouds, because every dark cloud was a potential tornado in Arkansas. And tornadoes were just the worst thing that could possibly happen. And they are pretty bad, but they're a whole lot worse when you're 6 years old thinking about it than when you're 72 thinking about it. Particularly since I've lived through a few tornadoes, now I know, yeah, you could actually survive a tornado. But from my parents' perspective, tornadoes were like, that was the worst thing, and we lived in these little shabby houses. So, so there's this fear of the weather. And then you start having, so for thunderstorms coming up, that's something to be afraid of. Now, I have to say, let me just say quickly, on the other side of that coin, my father was a sharecropper, so my brothers and sisters and I actually used to pray for thunderstorms in the afternoon when we were working in the field, because as soon as Daddy saw lightning, he would let us go home. So we just would be watching, and every now and again a thundercloud would get a streak of lightning, and we would be so happy to make that report so we could get ourselves out of the field. So it kind of worked that way too for us. But those nighttime fears about the weather stayed with me for a very long time. They've gone now. I mean, when I wake up and there's a thunderstorm, I just go back to sleep now. But this is what I mean. I want you now to be thinking to go way back into your heads and think some about some early stories, some of the early stories that you were taught, that were a part of your growing up. There is a big fancy concept in analytical psychology called the shadow. And some of you may know this concept from Jungian psychology. The shadow is those parts of ourselves that we don't quite know about. Just like a real shadow. If you see a shadow of something, you have some sense about it, but you can't really tell what it is. You could see my shadow on the wall. You would maybe know I'm a woman, but you won't know that I'm a black woman because it won't show up. You won't be able to tell what kind of clothes I've got on. So the shadow has these hidden things, some negative, some maybe not necessarily negative. Everything in the shadow is not necessarily negative. Some of it is just hidden. Another way to talk about that is that it's unconscious, that there's stuff in the shadow that's unconscious. So some of the shadow is constructed around stuff that has come to us maybe when you were 2 years old, before you could ever really be very articulate. There were things going on that sort of got into your psyche somehow or another, had some impression upon you, and you are carrying that as you get to be an adult. Now, you might have trouble believing this, but St. Paul kind of understood this when he talks about that there are things he wanted to do, but he couldn't. He would want to do this, but he'd do something else. It's sort of like you're in this kind of conflict with yourself. I want to be better than I am is basically, I think, what St. Paul was saying. So there is, and have you ever watched yourself respond to something in a way that really caught you off guard? It was a surprise to you. Maybe how angry you could get, or how disturbed you could be by something that wasn't big enough to have that level of disturbance with it. And sometimes when that happens, that's a good clue to start looking at, well, where's the root of that? Where did that come from? What is this about, really? To ask those kinds of questions, So you maybe be saying, well, I thought we were going to go and talk about race today. Well, we are. We're talking about it. Because at the very core of setting up systems to oppress other people is this stuff that I'm talking about. Where did that idea come from, that some people are better than some other people, and that somebody deserves to be in control of them? Where is that dynamic, where is the root system of the dynamic that believes that it's okay to enslave somebody, to choose somebody to not be free? I mean, what is it? And I don't really know the answer to that question, but I think that some of the answer lies in this stuff. This idea that you somehow have internalized this notion of supremacy. And how that notion, where was the first person that thought this thought? I don't know, and we're never gonna know. But that thought got put out there somewhere, and it got turned over and turned over and turned over. And then we started making connections to it. And then once you get going on that, then you start setting up kind of systems, and before you know it, you've created what we've got. And then we think, well, we just need to get rid of it. Yes, we do just need to get rid of it. But in order to get rid of it, we've got to tear up the foundation completely and start over. And we start by deconstructing the foundations inside of ourselves. So when we say we have to tear up the foundation, in America, people think, oh my God, you're some kind of anarchist, you want to get rid of the Constitution, blah, 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 and everybody goes running off down the road, not wanting to talk to you anymore. But the biggest job of deconstructing is internally. It is internally. When we begin to deconstruct the stuff inside of ourselves and tear down those borders. So talk about building walls. We've got walls inside of ourselves. And we learned that somehow. We learned, we got told you're supposed to think this about these things and this about this and this about this, and here are the categories, and you keep all this stuff separated, and this is how life works, and this is the way things go, and this is the way we live in the world, and this is how we interact with each other, and you got all these little communities inside ourselves that need to be, the walls need to be torn down so they can all become one community. So when we talk about having a beloved community out there, we got to start with creating a beloved community in here. And how do we do that? It's what I want you to spend a lot of time thinking about, because I think that we worry so much about the external beloved community so we don't have to do the internal work. Because we can preoccupy ourselves with that, and we stay so busy and preoccupied, and we completely forget that the hardest work we have to do is with ourselves. It does not mean that you don't have to work on making the world better. That's a part of the responsibility of a responsible human being. But the world's not going to get any better until we get better. That's just the absolute truth. It's like trying to make something be real that can't possibly happen because we didn't start at the right place. So it's hard to think about that I have some responsibility to help bring peace in the world by being a peaceful person. Because I just want all these world leaders to stop fooling around and create a world that's full of peace, and then let me sit and watch my junk on television and be unpeaceful and all that. I want them to fix it. Well, if I want it fixed, if I want violence to be fixed, then let me not be a partaker of violence. So I don't watch Law and Order and Criminal Minds and all that junk I used to watch, because I'm participating in violence when I do that. I'm helping to keep the energy system of violence alive by being a participant. And so that's a small thing. It's a small thing. And you end up watching, a cooking show. because it's hard to find anything on TV that's not violent except home TV and cooking shows, really. And I just got a TV again. I hadn't had a TV for like about 10 years, and I'm just appalled at how hard it is to find something that doesn't have somebody getting killed or slapped around or something, because that's the kind of culture we've got. So I hope you're understanding the great responsibility that we have as individual people to really be conscious about ourselves. So how have you been invited into the border construction work inside yourselves? How did you get invited as a little kid into that whole system? What are the narratives that invited you into that? You know, the narrative for me was you're black and there's a space you're supposed to occupy and you're not supposed to get out of that. You know, I learned that in segregated Arkansas. I learned that from my parents who were worried about my safety, because somewhere inside myself, I thought this stuff doesn't make sense to me and I'm not going to do it. And my parents thought you're not going to live to be an old person unless you get on the right track here. And so they worried. My mother used to worry because they'd take me to the doctor's office and I would refuse to sit down because the waiting room was segregated. And I didn't think that was right, that we should be sitting in a hallway and white people were sitting in a nice room. So my little 16-year-old self said, I'll just protest. And my mother was just shaking in her shoes because you weren't supposed to be doing that in Arkansas. But there was something in me that said, no, there's something wrong with this, and I'm not going to say yes to it. So what are the narratives? What narratives what are your stories? That's another way to put it. What are the stories? We've all got a long list of stories that contributed to helping us to construct our view of the world. And what is that view that we hold? How did you come by it? And who told you which stories? And how many of those stories continue to inform the way that you've constructed your life and the way you interact with life? You know, how many times have you thought that you don't want to be like your parents? Ever had that thought? And how much are you like them? You know, I just marvel at myself that I say stuff. I look like my mother, but that's okay because I couldn't help that part. But acting like her was something I thought I would not do. And my goodness, I'm just my mother in so many ways. And it's okay because my mother was pretty cool, actually, but I didn't used to think that, you know. You know how that goes when you grow up and find out that they really do know more than you thought they did. So shadow making. You don't make the shadow yourself. It gets made for you through the culture you're in, the household you're in, the school you go to, the church you go to, the jobs that you have. All of that feeds into this. But this whole notion of supremacy is a projection then of some of that stuff back out into the world. Some people argue that if people have this if there's some places that feel inferior inside of ourselves, that we then sometimes will find people outside to project that stuff onto, and then we start trying to do stuff to fix it with them rather than fixing it inside of ourselves. Now, I want to give you a better example because I'm condensing about 50 years of study here on Jung into this one conversation. So may Jung forgive me for doing this to him. But I do believe that this is so critical because we don't talk about this stuff in the church. We act as if, I don't know what we think. I mean, we say, like I said before, we say a lot of words, but we don't get into really digging into them and seeing what is this really all about. So Jung talks about the Germans projecting their shadow onto the Jews. And look what happened. I think that the Europeans projected their shadow on the Africans and decided that was, you know, a whole bunch of stuff. They were enamored with them in the first place because they were different. And then they decided they were so different until they were good fodder for their whatever use they wanted to use them for, including slavery, but anything else too. And so there's this the projections, this taking something that's inside of you and putting it out on somebody else, and then naming them as being something based upon it's all on you. Have you ever been driving down the road and see somebody in a certain kind of car and start telling yourself a story about them? Have you ever done that? Thinking what they must be like, how they must live, who they must be. Have you ever done it? So, okay, that's called projection. Have you ever said, and I know they thought so and so? Have you ever said that? Now, let me see. How did you get inside their head? How did you get inside that person's head to know what they really thought? So all of that is what you are thinking. I'm thinking you must be thinking this, so I'm saying you're thinking this. You've done it. All of us have done it. She was thinking so and so. Well, you just so off the page when you're saying that because you didn't know what the person was thinking. And we think that we think we know. It's called projection. And let me say to you, projection is not. There's no right or wrong or bad or good here. It just is. It is what we do. We look at people and we think something about them. But whatever we are thinking about another person, it's only in our head. And we think it's so hard until we think it's true. Right? Because I'm thinking this, and I know, and I'm having this reaction to you, and blah, blah, blah. So this all must be what's really going on. And the truth is, I'm having a conversation with myself. So Jung thought, I don't agree with him let me say that before I tell you what he thought, and then I'll tell you what I think. That if everybody withdrew their shadow back to themselves and claimed their own stuff and stopped this assigning things to other people, that the world would be peaceful and free and everything would be fine. Now, I disagree because I do believe that evil is real. I believe evil is a spirit that's alive in the world, and that some people give themselves over to evil. So I think it's going to take a little more than everybody withdrawing their shadows back to themselves. But I do think if we all would do our own shadow stuff, that the world would be much better off. I think there would still be evil but I think evil would have so much of a harder time if we weren't willing to be open to its energy. Because that's, to whatever extent I don't want to be hanging on to God in a day, I'm open to the possibility of evil being a tool for evil. And I don't think evil's going to get you and me by making us embezzle money or kill anybody. But one of the biggest ways evil gets us is to make us be distracted so that we are not doing the first thing first. We are not being true to what we need to be in the moment. That's one of the ways, the destabilization of us as these very literate, wonderful people, and we don't even know it because we're just so busy going down the road. We're not paying attention. So for me, my greatest thing I have to worry about in terms of evil is to not be distracted. To not be distracted. To do the first thing first. To stay willing to kind of pay attention. And to pay attention to myself too, So somebody walks in the room and they don't speak to you in the way that you want them to speak, and your day is ruined. Have you ever had that happen? Somebody just snubbed you just a little bit, and the day just turned sour. That ever happened to you? Am I the only one? So, have you ever gotten up in the mornings and you felt really good, and the world was okay, and you were okay, and you got ready and you went out on your day, and about mid-morning, you felt deflated and you don't know where the air went, but somehow it got out of your system and you don't quite know what happened. And so because you're trying to be conscious, you sit yourself down and you try to walk yourself back through the day and see what happened. And you walk back to the point where somebody didn't say something that you wanted them to say, or said something that you didn't want them to say. Or you remembered the dream you had last night that was very disturbing, whatever. But you walk back to that moment and find that if you do that, sometimes if you do that, you can salvage the day, because then you can deal with that and not let it become the rest of the day. But if you don't do that, then sometimes the whole day gets ruined, and you go home in the evening feeling so much worse than you started out in the morning, and it was that one little thing back there that got you. So that's how the psyche is so always involved in all of this. And we don't act like we have psyches. I don't know who we think we are, but we're just like everybody else. We're walking around with this conglomerate of psychological people, and we have all these selves that are operating in us. And unless we're in conversation with that inner community, it's running around doing what it wants to do, and we're out here thinking we're in charge of something. And we're not in charge of anything because we're not in charge of the inner community. And then we wonder why the outer community is so crazy. And it's a reflection. It is just such a reflection. So I feel very called to try to help Christians start really paying more attention to this stuff and really saying, now let me see. This is happening. How am I contributing? How am I contributing to this? What's going on with me? And one other thing I want to say, and then we're going to watch a little bit of a video here in a minute, is that if we don't make peace in this inner community, we are much more interested in chaos than we are calm. Because if we are distressed inside of ourselves, chaos makes more sense to us. So part of the reason why we are so welcoming of violence in our world is because we have not made peace inside of ourselves. Violence makes sense to us because we have this stuff. If war is going on inside of yourself, you don't want peace outside. A better example is this. Have you ever had somebody speaking to you when you were having a really rotten day and thinking the world was kind of piled up on top of your head, and here comes this bouncy person that's all energetic and excited and happy and thinking everything is fine? How'd you like relating to them? You really want them to go on somewhere else, don't you? Right? So we kind of bring to us some affirmation of what is in us. So if we are peaceful and feeling like we're on the right page and God's taking care of us, we're okay with folks being in that space. But when we're down and out, feeling a little down and out, or feeling a little sorry for ourselves, or a little piled up under whatever the burdens of our lives are, we don't really want to engage that kind of peacefulness. Right now, it's difficult in this country to talk to people about hope because people are afraid and in despair. And every day I find myself having to just be like a little bull in a china closet to stay focused on hope, because I refuse to live in fear or despair. I will not do it. And so if you want to be in fear and despair, then you don't need to talk to me. And I'm no Pollyanna, I guarantee you. But I believe God's bigger than every situation that we can construct. And so I think that's a reason to have hope. And so when I had an automobile accident, and I was talking to the claims adjuster, and I was being so thankful that I ran into the back of somebody because I wasn't paying attention. So I deserved to be in much worse shape than I was in. I was okay, thanks be to God. And the woman that I hit was just an absolute angel. And we both ended up saying if we had to have a wreck, we were glad it was the two of us. And even the insurance adjuster talked about what a nice woman she was. So I pay all this money to Allstate in case I have a wreck. So I got a new car, actually. I tore her bike up. They bought her a new bike. Neither of us were hurt. Actually, her bike, she was more worried about her bike than anything else. I ended up with my car being totaled. That's all. It was inconvenient. It was messy. We could have been hurt, but we weren't. And I was just beside myself with gratitude. Why not? So I'm talking to this insurance adjuster, and she's trying to make me be down in the mouth about it. So she's saying all this stuff about how awful it is and blah, 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 blah. And I said, well, no, really, it wasn't. It was bad. I'm sorry I had the wreck. I'm glad I didn't hurt her or myself. But then all these things, and I'm being all upbeat like I just told you. She finally just quit talking to me because I was just not going to be in that space she wanted me to be in, which was to be down in the mouth and complaining. Why do I need to complain? Now, had I killed somebody, that would be a different subject. Or had I been crippled, or if I'd had no insurance, that would have been a different subject too. But none of those things were so. But that particular story is so illustrative of the way we are right now in our country. Maybe we've always been this way, I don't know. But there's just everywhere you turn, somebody wants you to be afraid, worried, or in despair, rather than hopeful and feeling like there's no reason to be in despair. Life is what it is, and you do the work you need to do. And so it's about what's going on internally. Now, if you don't take anything else away from this day today, I want you to be clear that most of what's happening externally to you has got something to do with what's going on internally. And you might not think so. You may think that there's just this world happening out there. But we have so much to do with what comes to us. So if you're going out into the world expecting people to beat you up and not care about you, that's what you'll find. If you go out into the world expecting people to be loving and kind and treating you right, that's what you'll find. I have to think about that, I don't really have bad experiences with people because I'm not expecting to have any bad experiences. And if somebody's trying to create a bad experience for me, they've got hard work on their hands. Because I'm just, I don't need it. I'm 72 years old. I've earned the right to be this peaceful old woman now because I've worked hard to get there, and I intend to be there. So pay attention to your inner community is the thing I think that's so critical. And it's critical to the whole process of racial healing in our country. Completely critical. Because to the extent that we are conversant with all the parts of ourselves, we have less need to create others out there to bear our projections. Does that make sense? Okay, because that's critical to this discussion. That when new people come into the city, I think I understand from Father Chris that you've had a lot of Puerto Ricans, is that correct, have come into your community, and that people haven't been as hospitable to Puerto Ricans as they need to be. Well, why do we need to other them would be the question. What is it? What is the dynamic in the people? I don't know where these folks are, if they're in your parishes or wherever they are, but what is the dynamic that's going on that makes it necessary for us to create a new group of others? That's a question, and that's not the question that we ask. We have all kinds of other things. For one thing, we want to blame people for showing up and making us have to be uncomfortable. That's the first thing we do, rather than say, why am I uncomfortable? What is it in me that needs you to be somebody other than just another human being who showed up, and why can't I be compassionate towards you? And it's not the question, it's the question. Ask your parishioners whenever an othering issue is coming up, ask the parishioners, why do we need to make this person other? Why is that necessary? What is it? What is it in me that wants to project rather than accept? And it's not like you're being a bad person. It's that when you ask that question, you're trying to be conscious, trying to understand. You know, when I see somebody that I just absolutely don't like, I have to say to myself, what's going on with this? Sometimes it's somebody I don't like and I don't even know them. There's just some vibrations that are off. And I start with, that just happened to me in Honduras recently. And I really had to interrogate myself, as Bell Hooks would say, to try to understand what was going on, because I didn't really know that person. But they just were, I was just making some projections that were all in my head, all my own stuff. So remember, I started out talking about the premises that we agree upon, that the Lord is our shepherd, that there's neither male nor female, there's neither Jew nor Greek, we're all, and I take that to mean that we're all one in Jesus, that God looks at us all. God looks at all of us whether we're in Jesus or not. God looks at every human being because every human being in the world was made by God. So I want that to be the premise that we operate under, that God made all these folks. And we agree that there is one God who is the creator of all. And so then all folks fall, if there's going to be a category, everybody's in it, the one category. There's one category, and everybody's in it. And then we have come to be who we are because of the stories we've been told and because of the ways we've been socialized and educated and the things that we have bought into. The paradigms that we have decided to live our lives with have created the folks, all of us sitting in this room. And we bring all kinds of stories and all kinds of histories and experiences to this room, to this moment. We all got here by a long journey of a whole lot of input. If you could spread all those narratives out, it would be amazing to see the picture that we have. And we constructed reality in this country out of that system. And one of those constructions that we made is the reason why we can't quite figure out how to live together. It's a construction called racism. The empowerment of prejudice against people of color in this country, the notion of supremacy, which is an indefensible position because there is no supremacy except God. The white skin supremacy that we constructed, we made it up. We made that up, and we can unmake it. It's difficult for us to think we can unmake it because it's so ingrained in our culture until we almost think that it's always been there. But we made it up. And so I want us in a minute to watch a little bit of this film called from Tim Wise. Some of you know him and heard of him, called White Like Me. And we're just going to look at privilege, white privilege, for a minute. But I want you to think about this in a different kind of way. Because generally when we talk about white privilege, a lot of white folks head for the hills and say to me many times, I do workshops like this all over the United States, mostly with Episcopalians, and many times I hear, but I didn't have any privilege because I grew up poor and I grew up without this and without that. Well, it doesn't matter because we made up the story that said white skin is better than not white skin. That's the privilege, that white skin is better, that notion of white skin is supreme got started somewhere, and it didn't start with you. So really and truly, if you want to feel guilty about it, you should get over it because you didn't start the story. You know, don't claim that you started the story. You didn't start the story. You inherited the story, but you didn't start it. And even though Rabbi Heschel says that in a democratic society, some of us are guilty of a few things, but all of us are responsible. So we're responsible, I think, and I prefer to think about responsibility than guilt. We're responsible to open our heads up and not be unconscious, but to be guilty is just a waste of energy because guilt just makes you feel bad. And when you feel bad, you don't do anything, right? You just get immobilized. And so then, you've been distracted by evil from being on the path you need to be on. So what we did was construct this idea of skin supremacy and then built a whole bunch of stuff around that. And we institutionalized that in our country, and we call that institutionalized racism. But what I want you to do as you're watching this little clip of Tim Wise, I want you to think about the internal workings that I've been talking about here for the last hour. I want you to look at this construction of privilege from that perspective of what were the inner dynamics going on that made people think they need to make rules that kept this group of people out and let this group of people in. I want you to look at it from that kind of going in it from a different direction rather than just looking at it from the political, social point of view. Because socio-political stuff is fueled by these internal fires. And we can't ever get at the deconstruction of the socio-political if we don't pay attention to what the internal driving force is that's creating that stuff in the first place. That's why it ends up, you're up here trying to take down something that's got a root system that's so deep, and you're not even addressing the root system. And if you don't address the root system, you just kind of, it's like there's some kinds of weeds that grow. You can keep cutting them off, but if you don't dig them up, you're just wasting your time, right? So that's what we do around race. We keep cutting the top off, but we don't dig up the roots. And so I want you to be looking at the root system differently now. So I don't know where the person is who's showing the right here. So we're gonna watch just a little bit of this, and then we're gonna talk about this a little bit more, and then I have a little exercise that I want you to do together. So I don't know.
When it comes to race, we've overcome quite a lot in this country. Slavery, Civil War, segregation. We've even elected a black man to the highest office in the land.
Change has come to America.
But as tempting as it might be to celebrate these things as signs that we've entered into a period of colorblind, post-racial harmony,
we have to admit that we're moving forward in this world and that race issues are moving to the periphery.
I think those problems are largely behind us.
the fact is, racial inequalities still exist.
Today, there are more African Americans in prison or jail on probation or parole than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began.
And racial bias still affects the way we view others.
I want you to check out this protester. See the sign he's waving there? It's the president made to look like an African witch doctor.
And when we fail to recognize that, we not only continue to do an injustice to people of color, we end up doing damage to white folks as well. I'm Tim Wise, an anti-racist educator and author. I grew up in the South, in Nashville, Tennessee, and at a very early age, I figured out that race mattered. My parents were educated in a completely segregated environment, and wanting me to have a different experience than they had had, they decided to send me to a preschool program at Tennessee State University, a historically black college. In a class of about 20 kids, I was one of only 3 students who weren't black. The teachers, the staff, the administrators there were also mostly African American. And this meant that from a very young age, I learned to respect black authority figures in a way that many of my white peers probably wouldn't have. And this seemingly minor detail made a huge difference in how I came to see the world. It meant that most of my early friends were black. As a result, once we started elementary school and I began to notice how those black friends were treated differently by the teachers, it affected me. And even though I didn't really have a word for what was happening then, that racial division is something I remembered even years later. For college, I attended Tulane University in New Orleans. It was the late 80s, and I got heavily involved on my campus, along with other students, trying to encourage Tulane to stop investing in companies that did business with the racist government of apartheid South Africa.
These university students want their school to get rid of its investments in stocks of companies that do business in South Africa, to divest. It's become a rallying cry on campuses all across the country.
We spoke out, we set up shanty towns on the college quad and in front of the administration building in solidarity with the anti-apartheid movement. But even then, as I was becoming radicalized to struggles for equality and justice, I was largely blind to the privileges I was receiving in my own town.
The situation lately has become more complicated in the wake of the killing of a policeman and the death of his accused killer.
Around this same time, just across town in New Orleans, a black man named Adolph Archie was beaten to death in police custody.
The minute it was discovered that Adolph Archie had died, everybody knew that the police had beat him to death.
I remember reading about Adolph Archie's murder in the paper, and I remember thinking how terrible it was, but I made no connection to what I was doing and the experiences I was having at Tulane. But that all changed a few weeks later. I was speaking one evening at an anti-apartheid event, and a young black female student from a neighboring college, Xavier University, asked me, in the 4 years that I'd been in New Orleans, what had I done to address racism and apartheid in that city, especially seeing as how I'd benefited from it. The feeling that came over me was like the way you feel when you see the flashing blue lights in the rearview mirror and you know you're busted. Because the truth is, I hadn't done much of anything. I had the privilege of choosing to address racism 8,000 miles away, while doing nothing in the face of de facto apartheid conditions that existed right there in my own backyard. It was a powerful moment, and it made me begin to reflect on my privileges more broadly, especially my privileges as a white person.
The next United States Senator from the state of Louisiana, David Duke.
In 1990, shortly after I graduated from Tulane, David Duke, lifelong Nazi, former Klan leader, the most prominent white supremacist in the United States, was running for the United States Senate in Louisiana.
You sell things, you pass out things called nigger hunting license, a nigger hunting license.
No, we do not. I do not pass out. I do not.
You do not, but your lieutenants do. Maybe you do. Says, having paid the license fee is hereby licensed to hunt and kill niggers, in caps, during the open season in Texas. This is beautiful, David. I mean, you know, for a guy who does it. It's also, I mean, it's a joke.
But it is a joke, yes. It is satire.
When I interviewed Dukes earlier this evening, he insisted that the campaign was not about his past, but about taxes, crime, and welfare reform. Nonetheless, he did acknowledge that race is an issue about which he has strong feelings.
There's racism going on in this country against white people. It's called affirmative action.
I was involved in the campaigns against him, ultimately working as the associate director of the Louisiana Coalition Against Racism and Nazism.
Appreciate it. Appreciate it.
His message appeals to many frustrated white voters who believe the civil rights movement has gone too far.
In the end, Duke lost the election. The Nazi was defeated. But he received a stunning 60% of the white vote. The next year, he ran for governor, and he lost again, but he still received a majority of that white vote. And I remember sitting there a couple of weeks after the governor's race, realizing there was something truly frightening about the fact that 6 out of 10 people who write the same thing on their census form that I do, that they're white, were willing to vote for a Nazi. I mean, I knew they weren't Nazis, but now I also understood they were willing to vote for a guy who was.
You've got a lot of good ideas that we've been saying for a long time. It's time somebody to do it.
What it told me was that as a white person, I had very specific work that I had to do around these issues because these were my people supporting this guy. And really, for me, it was a moment when I decided to try and use what I'd learned to change that mentality in my own community.
Joining us now is Tim Wise, an educator, anti-racist advocate, and the author of White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son.
For more than 20 years now, I've been trying to better understand for myself and to raise awareness, among others, about the centrality of race and racism to the history of this country, and how dangerous and damaging it is when white people, like me, are blind to racial inequality and our own privileges.
When you talk about white folk, you say white folk, white America. There are always some white folks in the room that think he hates white people. I get that a lot. You hate white people. I want to clear this up because I don't want to be misunderstood. I love me some white people. My wife is white. I love her. Those 2 little girls are white, which sometimes happens when you're both white. I love them.
When I was in high school, we read John Howard Griffin's classic book, Black Like Me. In the book, and in the movie version a couple of years later, Griffin, a white man, tells the story of how he darkened his skin with dye, medicine, and intense UV rays in order to experience what it was like for African Americans in the pre-civil rights South of the 1950s.
Well, what's the big idea? I want to find out what it's like to be a Negro in the South. You kidding?
Over the course of 6 weeks, Griffin recounts how he was harassed, followed, and threatened by racist whites.
You better find yourself another place to sit.
And in the end, he says that his assumption blacks were treated like second-class citizens turned out to be wrong. It was closer to 10th class.
You know what we do to troublemakers here?
No.
You kill a nigger and toss him in one of these swamps, nobody ever know anything about it.
The book became a bestseller and a sensation, and it had a profound impact on me and countless other high schoolers. But when I revisited the book as an adult, something stood out that I hadn't thought about as a kid. Toward the very beginning of the book, Griffin asks, how else, except by becoming a Negro, could a white man hope to learn the truth, ultimately concluding that the best way to find out if we had second-class citizens and what their plight was would be to become one of them.
White Southerner has to know what it's like to be a Negro. Really know.
And you know what it's like, huh? After 10 weeks or 3 months or whatever it is, you know.
No, I don't know. And I can never know.
Rereading this, I realized the entire premise was off. Griffin was attempting to understand racism by momentarily occupying blackness. He became a person of color. And while there's no question there's real value in whites trying to understand and ultimately empathize with the experience of African Americans, it struck me that we rarely, if ever, turn this line of thinking around. In other words, instead of asking what it's like to be black, what if we just asked what it's like to be white?
I don't really know what it means really to be white or what it's supposed to mean.
I guess I never really thought about it, but it was always kind of a negative thing.
When I ask students what it means to be white, what I hear from them is a lot of confusion.
The question, what does it mean to be white? It baffles my mind. I don't know what it means.
Whiteness isn't something we think much about, and in some ways, that makes perfect sense.
In terms of white culture, it's very general and very vague. Like I think sitting down and having dinner with my family. But all cultures do that.
Because when you're part of a dominant group, you're not forced to spend a lot of time thinking about how you fit in or about how your privileges as a member of the dominant group might affect others who don't belong to it.
In order to express ourselves, we don't have to fit into Black culture, Hispanic culture, Asian American culture. We can just kind of do what we want. And I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's just...
This doesn't mean that all white people have it easy or that there aren't differences between the struggles of poor and working class white kids who have to work for everything and rich white kids who have things handed to them. Of course, those differences are real. But none of that changes the fact that throughout the history of this country, being white has been far easier than not being white.
Oh God, I love being white. I really do. Seriously, if you're not white, you're missing out because this is thoroughly good. But let me be clear, by the way, I'm not saying that white people are better. I'm saying that being white is clearly better. Who could even argue? If it was an option, I would re-up every year. Oh yeah, I'll take white again, absolutely. I've been enjoying that. I'm gonna stick with white, thank you.
And let's face it, there's no denying that white people in the U.S. have had privileges throughout history that people of color simply haven't. Consider the very first law passed by Congress after ratifying the Constitution, the Naturalization Act of 1790, which said that free white persons and only free white persons could become full citizens of this country. Basically, our very first law as a constitutional republic gave white immigrants privileges that black people and immigrants of color and indigenous native North Americans weren't given, all of it based purely on skin color. And whether we want to acknowledge it or not, this kind of systematic white privilege and race-based favoritism is built into the very foundations of the country.
In 1935, Franklin D. Roosevelt put his signature on the Social Security Act.
Look at all the social programs that pulled the U.S. out of the Great Depression and helped create the middle class in this country. Programs like job insurance, which provided cash to people to give them a leg up as they looked for work.
To show how job insurance works, let's introduce Steve, a Louisiana worker who has just lost his job. He goes first to the nearest state employment office to register for a new job. Steve needn't hesitate about going in, because this office was set up just to help people like him.
But while Steve in Louisiana could apply for job insurance, not everyone else could.
Of course, he cannot collect if he belongs to any of the groups of workers that the law does not insure. These are agricultural workers, domestic service in private homes.
Agricultural workers and domestic service workers didn't qualify for assistance, and it turns out this had everything to do with race. These two jobs were overwhelmingly held by black people, and over 80% of all blacks worked in those professions. So the only way FDR could get Southern Democrats to support the Social Security Act was if he agreed to exclude those workers from benefits. This was a conscious attempt by some in Congress to exclude as many blacks as possible, and the net effect of it was to give preferential treatment to whites.
Thousands of people get a big thrill out of looking at model houses, and a much bigger thrill when they buy one.
It was the same story with crucial housing assistance for the American middle class. Loans provided by the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, allowed working-class families for really the first time in American history to own their own homes.
Home ownership is the basis of a happy, contented family life. And now, through the use of a National Housing Act insured mortgage, is brought within the reach of all citizens.
But the way the bill was written, the American dream of home ownership wasn't within the reach of everyone. For the first 30 years of the program, about 98% of the recipients were white. People of color were almost completely barred. Then there was the GI Bill, which provided immense benefits to returning veterans, including low-cost mortgages, loans to start a business, cash payments for tuition, and living expenses. What the GI Bill didn't do is protect black veterans, who qualified for that assistance also, from the kinds of legal discrimination rampant in pre-civil rights America. The result was that the vast majority of those who benefited from the GI Bill were white veterans. If a program like the GI Bill ended up disproportionately benefiting people of color, you know what we'd call that? We'd call it welfare. We'd call it a reward, a handout, a gravy train.
The GI Bill of Rights is not a reward, or a handout, or a gravy train.
But that's not the way it was described.
But rather an American way to make it easier for each man to take his place once again in the community and get some of those things for which he went to war.
And I'm not trying to say programs like these are bad. There's no question. They've been instrumental in creating and expanding opportunities for millions of people. The point is that we're being dishonest if we fail to explicitly acknowledge how they almost exclusively benefited white people.
Who is covered by the Social Security Act? People like these.
It needs to be understood that for hundreds of years, government assistance programs pumped literally hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars worth of wealth into the hands of white families before people of color even got to the starting gate. This is what we're talking about when we talk about white privilege, the structural advantages built into our very system that have helped white people, often without us knowing it, while making things more difficult for people of color.
For me, being white means that I'm treated as the default in a lot of cases.
Some of those privileges would be material, better job opportunities, better housing access, better educational opportunities, but some of them are psychological. Just the realization that I'm not going to be racially profiled when I'm driving around town or when I'm shopping in the mall, that I'm not going to be followed by store security because they think I might shoplift.
Before I got to college and stuff, I don't know, I was more of like a punk and what have you, so there were times where I would be like shoplifting, and my race occurred to me then because I was like, man, I feel like if I was any other race or ethnicity, I would be being watched by like security. So I felt very, you know, like nothing would happen, so I didn't really mind doing it because I didn't get caught ever.
I read a paper where somebody was listing an experience where it was a group of females talking about, what it's like to be a woman. And there was a white woman talking to a black woman saying, well, we have similar experiences because we're both women. And the black woman looks at her and says, no, we don't. And she goes, well, yeah, but we're both women. And the black woman says, no, because when you look in the mirror, you're a woman. When I look in the mirror, I'm a black woman. So it's that thing that you have to, it's that thing that you don't notice.
For myself, from the very beginning, I was seen as a bright and capable child, and I was tracked into the higher level classes. If I didn't do well, I never had to worry that it would be ascribed to my race, that someone might say, well, of course he didn't do really very well on the SAT because, he is white. And this isn't just an anecdotal one-off story. The fact is there are 20 to 25 years of research, studies which have found that students of color all around the country are worried about confirming negative stereotypes in the classroom. Any fear that somehow they might live down to a negative group stigma directly affects their performance on tests. That's something that I, as a white student, didn't have to worry about. And so we live with the legacy of inequality that began so long ago, but also the legacy of obliviousness that allows those of us in the dominant group to rarely even think about these matters. And even with all the changes and the progress we have seen, that is something that hasn't changed.
Thank you. So I want you, as I said before you started to watch this, to really think of the particulars. I don't know if you knew those particulars about those particular situations in our country, that piece of history, but that history grew out of something deeper than just the act itself. And so these kind of, what is the inner dynamic? If you could walk back into that some kind of way and be in the heads of the folks who came up with that stuff, wonder what they were really after. And I would submit to you that there were some fears, that some of those ways of thinking and behaving grew out of fear. And I started out some this morning saying a lot of the border making that we do, both internally and externally, is really about fear. And so what I want you to do now for a few minutes is to think about, just try as hard as you can to think about something in your life at some point, maybe early in your life, that you were really afraid of. Just an early fear. I told you mine about thunderstorms, tornadoes. Go back to childhood, because and you maybe haven't been invited to think about your childhood in a little while, so it might take you a minute, but to go back and think of a fear from childhood that you had about something. And it doesn't matter what it was if you can remember it. And so I want you to take a little time to think about that, and then I want you to connect to your partner at your table, to somebody at your table, and I want you to tell them what that fear is that you thought about. So just think for a minute. So now I want you to, the fear that you brought up, I want you to think about, where did that fear come from? So you talked about the fear, you named it to somebody. So now the next little bit of time talking to each other is, well, where did it come from? And then after where did it come from, is it really gone? Or does it have is it lingering anywhere in around now? How does it impact you now? Remember, I asked you to go back to childhood. So go back to that same partner and talk about, where did the fear come from? And do you see any remnants of it hanging around anywhere? You understand what I'm asking? Okay. Take a couple minutes to do that. So part of the reason for this little exercise is for you to start really kind of connecting to the fact that no matter how hard we all try to be people who are fearless, we can find a place in ourselves where we touch fear. And we have to be willing to know that place. And so much of what happens to us is that we are unwilling to know about those places. And then we end up projecting onto people out of a place that we don't know. That's what is that's unconscious. So when you can learn a lot about what's in your unconscious by looking at the people who bother you. Because honestly, if you just pay attention to that, when you start being bothered, then start asking, what is this about? The other thing, I don't know how much you pay attention to your dreams, but paying attention to dreams is very important in learning about the unconscious, because the unconscious is unconscious for a reason, and it's trying to protect itself. It is actually in service of the ego, and the ego has this understanding of who you are, and it intends to do everything it can to keep that understanding intact. So this new information that comes up from the unconscious to help you really become this integrated whole that God wants us to be is really in a big contest with this ego idea. You know, I'm this wonderful, educated, together person, but that's not always the case. And so I got to know that other little person, that little girl that's scared or that acts out or doesn't want to act right, needs to be a part of the equation. And if she isn't, then she's going to wreak havoc on me at times. So if you don't let all those parts come up to consciousness, then you go through life getting destabilized. So if you think about the persona kind of being like you got dressed and then you're walking out the door and you grab your overcoat and put it on, that's the persona. This is who I want the world to see, this persona, this coat that I'm wearing. But that shadow stuff is there. And to the extent that we don't let that shadow stuff become a part of the persona, we create some hollowness between us. And so it's like you got on a coat, but there's a lot of distance inside the coat. You ever wear something that's too big? So if you're wearing a persona that doesn't have that is not allowing the integration of that other stuff, you're wearing a coat that doesn't fit. And you know people that live their whole life with a persona that's not connected to the shadow. And when they get to be old, really old, they're really horrible. You know, that somebody has said that negative aging is that process of not allowing for integration, the integration of all of yourself. So you don't have to be a bitter, kind of old, shriveled up kind of person because you brought all of yourself with you, rather than you're out here living in this kind of, well, I think a better example is like when people can't work anymore and they don't know what to do with themselves because they haven't really integrated all of themselves. You know, when you're just at a loss, when you can't do what you used to do. I can't imagine if I live to be 100, there's just going to be so much stuff because I've got so much I want to do. And I'm just so excited at every stage to see what can I do now that I couldn't do. There's so much stuff I can think now that I didn't know how to think when I was 50. So it's so exciting, you know, and my kids worry, they think, Mama, one of these days we're going to see you'll be riding a motorcycle. But it's not into that kind of adventure. I want the adventure in my head, you know. I want my soul to grow and expand and to really embrace new ways of understanding and new ways of seeing things. But this business of being open to let me be influenced, let my persona, let this ego that I've constructed here be informed by the rest of who I am, even though I don't know what that is. I mean, that's what being transformed is all about. I mean, we talk about transformation. Like I said before, we say all these words and we don't know what in the world we're talking about. And nobody tells us. And I want us to start talking about real stuff in church. I want people to start hearing, I want people to start having to deal with the shadow. I want us to stop being, you know, naming stuff in the church as political when it's really shadow that we need to be working on, you know? I mean, we need to be transformed so that the world can see that God actually has some power. But as long as we just keep on living out of our made-up selves, it's difficult to see what God's got to do with that. So I'm just evangelistic about this if you didn't catch on yet. So, because I think it's so critical to the dynamic of being people of faith in this world and to setting us free and to moving toward racial healing and creating a world where everybody can really be who God put them on the earth to be. So I want to say that knowing a little bit about our own fear, even though we're trying not to live in fear, I honestly don't want to live in fear, but I know that when it comes to the safety of my sons in this world, that I have an edginess about that borders on being fear. And I have to watch out every day about it because I feel the most comfortable. My sons are 32 and 37, and I feel better when I know that they're in their house than when they're out anywhere. And sometimes I have to catch myself because every now and again they tell me they worry about me. Well, I don't worry about me because I'm an old black woman, and who's going to bother an old black woman? But, the truth of the matter is they're right to worry a little bit, but not just a little bit. But it's important for me to know what that uneasiness is about and to own it and to live with it up in my hands rather than trying to pretend it doesn't exist. So whatever the fear, whatever the lack of healing we have inside of ourselves, whatever the disjuncture, whatever the dissonance we have, somehow we need to be able to own that, to speak it into ownership, to say, I want to be this way, but I know I'm this way. So you have some sheets of paper on your tables. And some of you have your own paper. I brought paper just in case because we have so much technology these days, people don't carry paper with them. I want you to fold the sheet of paper in half like this. Just fold it in half. And if you don't have a pen, get a pen from somebody quickly and quietly. All right. You should have a piece of paper and a pen. So on the outside of your paper, I want you to write at least 5 good qualities that you could name for yourself. 5 of your best qualities. 5 of your best qualities on the outside of the paper. And as soon as you finish writing those 5 best qualities, open the paper on the inside and write the opposite of whatever you have written. So if you put generous, then on the inside you should put stingy. Whatever the opposite is of your best qualities. And can I ask you not to confer with your neighbor? I want you to just think about this yourself and do it. This is another way to get at shadow. You see, I told you that, it's an elusive concept in a lot of ways. But think about the opposite. So we tend to think about ourselves as, if you think about yourself as being a really compassionate person, you can also think about yourself as being somebody who is the opposite of that, or friendly or kind or whatever. And to just be willing to kind of be in that kind of conversation with ourselves is liberating because it helps us not to kind of get ourselves into kind of a understanding of being kind of static. Because whatever I am, I'm also the opposite of that. And that's the complexity. And so then when I run into that factor out in the world, I don't have to make up anybody to be that way, because I know I can be stingy, though I'm generous. So when I see somebody who's stingy, I don't have to hate them so much because I understand stingy, right? But if I think I'm just above stingy, then I meet a stingy person and I just, they just need to be put off the planet. You know, do you get it? So if we are conversant with that other side of ourselves, we become more compassionate when we meet that out in the world. So the projections, we don't need to make a projection because we already know that about ourselves. So the really staunch racist, somewhere that's totally removed from anybody who's different from him or her, is somebody who's got a whole lot of stuff inside that they're unconscious about. And they got to project that. So they've got to be scared of Catholics and Jews and black folks and Native people and transgender people. That kind of fear that fuels that fire comes out of deep unconsciousness. And all of us struggle with unconsciousness. So I don't get to kill the staunch racist because I'm kin to that person, because I'm unconscious too. I just am not as unconscious as they are about some things. So, so the main thing is to get off of our horses, our high horses. And we all got some little high horses that we think we pretty well deserve to be on. And but the truth of the matter is, if we dig deep enough, we'll find a place where we fall off the horse. And, Henry Nouwen has this amazing image in the book, The Wounded Healer, where he talks about all of us are wounded and we're just telling each other where to find the bandage closet. So I found the bandage closet and I'm talking about it. But I also know that I've got to get my own bandages too. And it's so freeing to realize that yes, I know where the bandages are and I got some of them and I'll help you get there. And that's such a good way. And that's who we are as people of faith. We're in this together, trying to help each other get to the bandages and not trying to criticize anybody because they need a bandage, right? I mean, I need bandages, you need bandages, and we know where the closet is, and we'll tell each other. So that those kinds of things help us to get this inner work done in a better way, and it ends up to be good for the whole in such good ways. So the last thing I want to talk about before lunch, and I'm going to have to do this really fast because lunch is upon us, is this whole notion of implicit bias. Implicit bias is, again, rooted in fear. And these are biases that we have that we sometimes we don't know. I mean, it's another kind of unconscious thing. For instance, when people say, oh, well, our parish is just not ready to have blank kind of rector, where is that coming from? And maybe they don't even have the consciousness to say that, but they can't ever bring themselves to choose an application for somebody that doesn't fit the category that they've all kind of agreed is what they have to have. So that or you have this kind of not so accepting feeling about somebody from a certain region of the country, but you don't quite even know that. You just kind of keep ignoring these people from the Northeast or from the Southwest or wherever. There's a lot of that kind of stuff that floats around. A lot of it, some of it is more than gets outside of being implicit when it comes to like prejudice against people because of their names and prejudice against people because of their economic status or whatever. But when you make up your mind about something, when you make up your mind that something is true, even though you don't really know, you don't have much information, it's coming out of some sensibility more than any facts, then you're making up this story and telling yourself that this is the way this needs to be, and it's mostly just based on a bunch of feelings. It's not rooted in real information, then it's hard for you to see anything different. So in a minute, I want you to watch a little film. It's called Lunch Date, that you might have seen somewhere. And it's looking at bias and what happens to you when you make up your mind about something, how difficult it is to see something different when your mind's made up already, and how much we miss because we've made up our minds already. So I always like to show this little film just before lunch because it's about folks in lunch. So we're gonna watch this. It's in black and white, and it's about 7 or 8 minutes long, and you have to watch really carefully or you'll miss a lot of it. So pay close attention.
Don't. Please don't touch them. I'll take care of those.
All right, let me give you a hand.
No,
huh?
don't. No. You're making me miss my train. How much is this salad?
$2.
Well, I'm not sure that I have that much. $1. Here's some more. Here's some more.
All right, $1.52. There you go, lady.
Thank you. Napkin?
Surely.
My salad.
That's my salad. No, thank you. Thank you.
Oh my God. Oh my Lord.
Anybody got any change? Any change? Can you make some change to eat, please, man. God.
So when you make up your mind, you can't see what's in front of you. When you make up your mind that something is true, it's difficult to see something different. So what I want you to do with this little film, and by the way, this little film is online, so you can access it. You can actually access Tim Wise also, I think, from YouTube, and we're going to watch a short little, like 8-minute film after lunch that can also be found online. And the reason why I'm telling you this is because these are things you can replicate in your own settings. You could use this film, you can use Tim Wise, and these kinds of days are most helpful if you take something away from them that you can do later in another setting. And you could do this in a Wednesday evening event or even a Sunday school class, actually, for these really short ones. But what I want you to do with this little film is to put yourself in it and ask yourself which character are you in this film? Which character do you identify with the most? You know, the guy behind the counter that's watching what's going on and knows what's going on, but he doesn't say anything, but he's scratching his head because he sees that this woman is eating this man's salad instead of her own. The woman herself, the man who's allowing her to eat share with his salad and offering her compassion and hospitality, actually. So who are you? Which one of these characters would you be in this, and maybe a conglomerate of them or more than one? I want you to think about that as we are breaking for lunch. So what I'd like you to do for just a few minutes is to talk to your neighbors about which character you were in the lunch date. So we'll just start with that. We're just going to take 2 or 3 minutes for it, but I want you to talk to somebody about which one of those, which persons did you identify with the most? Which character did you see yourself being? I don't know how, I of course couldn't hear all the conversation, but I hope the movie generated that much energy. So again, I think I want to just highlight that these are things you can replicate back in your parishes. A lot of what people say to me when I'm doing this work around the country, how do we get a conversation going? How do we get a conversation started about difference, about race, about dismantling oppression, about this whole subject? And these are ways to get a conversation going. You know, I don't know how many of you know each other, but you can actually get a conversation going with strangers around these films because it's one step removed from the person a little bit to be reflecting on something else other than yourself, about yourself. And so that's a good way to get a conversation going. So this morning we talked about shadow and projection, and we talked about implicit bias a little bit and looked at the little film that kind of helps us to illustrate that. And I want to spend a little bit of time now talking about, okay, so you make the projection out there somewhere. It's got to connect to somebody. It's got to connect on to somebody. So what happens when you make a projection onto another person, and that person takes your projection of them in as if that's real? So you project somebody into being, you tell a child, you're clumsy. You know, you give them that message. You project them into being clumsy, and they grow up to be clumsy. Or there are lots of different kinds of ways we do that. We kind of put people on paths, but if we have a way of seeing people, then we try to make them live into that, and then a lot of the time, people will do just that. So what we did in America is we projected the notion of supremacy, white skin supremacy, up on people who were brought here from Africa and up on Native peoples. With the Native peoples, we just pretty much killed them and got rid of them. With the Africans, we enslaved them. The Native peoples didn't do too well with that, even though we tried it some. And we projected the supremacy notion upon the slaves, and then we created a structure that reinforced the projections. We created structures of dehumanization and denigration that bore witness to the projection of inequality that we had. So you see, I mean, and it's interesting when you stand back from it and look at it as an analyst as opposed to when you're just living in it. Because when you're just living in it, you're living out of fear, you're living out of whatever, and setting up structures and doing stuff and don't quite even know what you're doing. But this is the history. This is the legacy that we have in this country together as black, white, and brown, and whoever else comes here, Native peoples. This is the history. And whether we like it or not, we can't just erase it, even though we sometimes try. So one of the things that we're doing in Georgia is remember the people who were lynched in Georgia, with 600 people lynched in Georgia. And we're putting up markers to remember them and calling their names and having memorial services for them, because we need to atone for that sin, and for the memory of terror in the black community, and for the memory of holding it up as an okay thing in the white community. In both communities, it was a detriment. It was an injury. The moral injury that came to white people from being invited to participate in lynching is something that we don't like to talk about, don't want to think about, and don't talk about. But until we tell the truth about it, it's just always going to be there haunting us. And once we tell the truth, we can go on. So we did two marker services, one in 2015, one in 2016, and one last year. And in 2016, we remembered 17 people. And last year, we remembered 56 people and put up a marker with all their names on it. And we are going to partner with the Equal Justice Initiative to bring all of the columns that they have remembering people who were lynched back from Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. I hope you know about that initiative and that museum that just opened, remembering lynched people. And some of those people were in Florida. So if you don't know about it, you need to go online and look them up. And somebody needs to get in touch with EJI and find out if they have any columns there for people who were lynched in your particular county in Florida, because they've identified over 4,000 people who were lynched, and they've built a museum. Do you know the EJI museum? Okay, so at the museum, they have these removable columns that you can bring to your county that has the names of the folks who were lynched in your specific county. And that's one project that we're taking on as the Diocese of Atlanta. And as director of the Center for Racial Healing, I'm encouraging people to do that all over the place, because we do not need to keep on trying to think that we can just pretend that that piece of history didn't happen. And that's what we've been trying to do. When we said we were going to remember lynched people, people started, even some people in my own church, started wanting to know, well, why are you bringing up that? Well, it's not like I'm bringing it up. It's right here. It's up. We're just trying to pretend it's not. So you have to ask, why have we done so much work for so long around trying to create racial justice, and we have so little racial justice? And my contention is because we have tried to build the process of racial justice on a foundation that wasn't constructed in the right way. And so every little bit of gain that we make, because we were on this shaky foundation, there's always somebody under there digging at the root of it, trying to see if we can go back to where we were, because we didn't do the transformational work that needed to be done. And it's not too late, of course. We can always, you start where you are. So remembering those people who were lynched and calling their names and and I'm just enough of a mystic to believe that perhaps it helps them too, even though they're on the other side of the veil. Perhaps it helps them to find some peace, to know that somebody in the 21st century remembers them and is calling their name and saying prayers in response, in regards to them. I don't know, and it doesn't really matter. The thing that matters is to be obedient. And what we're called to do is to do the work. But I just have this feeling that there's a chance. I know it's amazingly healing for us, and we will keep on doing it until we get all 600 people remembered in Georgia. And of course, it was more than 600, we know that. So on every one of our markers, we put into those who are unknown, because there are folks whose names we're never gonna know. But it's like, we're cleaning up the slate here. And now we're building something on a slate that is a defensible slate, finally, because we've done the work, this piece of work. And the other thing that we did while I'm passing this, let me just tell you, is that we connected, because one of the things we love to do in doing this work is to do stuff in silo ways. We don't like to connect. What are the intersections? So we connected slavery, lynching, the prison industrial complex, the death penalty, and 21st century police killings. We connected all of that and said it's the same energy system that is fueling all of this stuff. And so we have to look at it in this holistic way so that we stop thinking that this has happened. These things are not discrete. These things are connected. The prison industrial complex in America is a very well thought out, is the result of a very well thought out strategic plan for managing Black people. So if you watch the movie 13th, if you read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, you'll get a better understanding of the strategicness of the prison industrial complex. There are people who think that the prison system is just a result of Black and brown people being worse than anybody else. And it's not so. So we spent all last year looking at that as we prepared to go put this marker to remember the lynched, so that people understood, first of all, we're not going on a field trip. We don't do field trips. We do pilgrimages. And pilgrimages are supposed to lead you somewhere different from where you were. So when you go on a pilgrimage and come back, you should be different from who you were when you went. And so, but in order for that to be the case, you need to do some preparation. And the preparation was to really try to understand some of those pieces of history. And we showed the movie 13th. You familiar with the movie 13th? We showed the 13th made on the movie by Ava DuVernay on the 13th Amendment, the little clause in the 13th Amendment that made it possible to re-enslave Black people. So you could be picked up for vagrancy, and if you were an ex-slave, what else were you gonna be except vagrant? Because where were you gonna be? That became a crime. It was a way to re-enslave the formerly enslaved, and to create a workforce. It was really a way to do something about creating a better workforce. And so the 13th Amendment is kind of the root place. Go watch the movie. That's a good assignment. Go watch the movie, because it's on Netflix for free. And you may be just even online now, because they really wanted people to watch it. It is an amazingly well-done movie. You will learn more about the prison industrial complex than you ever wanted to know, and learn what a multi-billion-dollar industry it is, and all of these people who look like they're innocent, like ATT and a whole bunch of other folks that are benefiting from it. So it's important for us to be awake to what that whole system is. And that movie does an excellent job, and you need to watch it at least 5 times. Because the first 2 or 3 times you just stay stunned, and then after that you kind of start being able to sort of process what you're watching. I'm not exaggerating here when I say how critical I think this movie is. I really think we should be showing it on Sunday mornings during worship time. We should be showing the movie and celebrating communion, because it's that powerful and that important. So please make it your business to watch it and then to see how you might use it in your parishes. We've shown it about 30 times in the Diocese of Atlanta, and we're hoping to get it shown 30 or 40 more times, because it's that critical, I think, to a better understanding, and also to understand what's going on with the police killings and how all that stuff is related. It's not unrelated energy systems that keep on fueling these fires that are so hard to put out. And when we start understanding that, then we get a better sense of how to go about trying to do something to make a difference. We also understand why it's so hard to make a difference, because we're just up against, well, we're really up against powers and principalities and spiritual wickedness in high places. That's what we're really up against. And this is how it manifests itself. And so it's important to be conscious. You know, what I'm rallying here for and being evangelistic about, let's be Christians who are conscious. Let's be awake. Let's know the lay of the land. And then we can talk differently with people. And we don't have to have these conversations where all we do is throw a whole bunch of blame around all over the place instead of really understanding there's a bigger picture and all of us are in this picture together and have to do something about how we get liberated. And God is interested in liberation. I do believe that. I do think that if I didn't think liberation were possible, I'd just go home and make greeting cards. Because that would make more sense to me, you know, than to be here talking about this stuff. So when projections are put out, somebody is out there. You're projecting onto something. And some people will wear those projections, will take them in, will believe that what is being said about them or to them or how the energy is being sent out to them. I don't know exactly how it all works. It's just a whole bunch of psychic dynamics so that you project onto somebody and there's something in them that sort of accepts that takes it on. When that comes to the dynamic between blacks and whites, what happens to the black people is that they begin to internalize these notions of oppression. So you start thinking that the way you've been treated and talked about and looked at is somehow the way it should be, rather than resisting. Now, I don't know what it is that makes some people resist and other people not. I told you earlier that as a kid, I resisted the stuff I didn't like. You know, I didn't sit down in the doctor's office. I didn't want to go to the back window to get an ice cream cone. My daddy would do it. I loved the ice cream, but I wouldn't go get it. My little best rebellious self. And so when I moved to Georgia after graduating from college, every time I called my mother, she'd say, "Where are you?" Because she thought I was going to one of these days be calling her from jail. And I managed to not go to jail. I mean, you know, probably should have gone sometimes, but I didn't. But Mama was of the old school who knew that in order to be safe, you had to be careful. And I was not crazy, and I didn't just go out to look for trouble, and I actually didn't create much trouble, actually. But I also had this sense, there was something in me, like an innate resistor, you know, that just says, there's some things that I'm just not buying. And thank God that I was right, and then God has led me down paths that helped me to understand a bit more about what that energy system is. And I think that there may be some people who do that more naturally than other people, because some people just don't quite fit into the ways, don't accept projections, I guess, that way. And some people who do. And I don't know how you explain that unless you could live inside that person's body. It doesn't really matter to explain it. It's just that is a phenomenon. And so we had a lot of white projections to black people that black people took in as true, and we call that internalized oppression. So now I've talked to you about shadow privilege, white skin privilege, implicit bias, and now this term, and persona, which is that psychological clothing, that way we go out into the world, the way we want the world to see us, and now internalized oppression. And I want us to watch this little film called A Girl Like Me, which is 8 minutes long, 7 or 8 minutes long, made by a 16-year-old. And it helps to look at, it's an illustration of internalized oppression, what happens when that happens. A lot of white people don't understand black people having internalized oppression. And a lot of white people who are kind and good and trying to do the best they can get so disturbed when they run up against black people who are angry and tired and fed up and tired of being unliberated. And so it's important to understand what that dynamic is about, because it's it is what it is. I had one of my actually it was my former rector who just went ballistic on me one day when I was talking about dismantling racism, telling me how much work he'd done all of his life, and it all seemed so useless and hopeless, and black people just didn't want to be relating to him, and on and on and on. And it took me aback so badly until I was pretty much stunned in the conversation. So I just listened to him, and then after I got my bearings and could think of something to say, I really realized that what was wrong with him was that he had spent his life reaching out and hadn't been able to establish meaningful relationships with black people, and he was hurt. And so to speak to his hurt was what I needed to do, rather than, after kind of picking myself up off the floor and dusting myself off at his outburst about how useless he thought dismantling racism work was, as much of it as I do. That was a little, took me a minute to collect myself. But he basically was sharing his grief about not being able to build meaningful relationships. And I don't know what that was about, really, what that is about. It may be that he has trouble building meaningful relationships with anybody. That's a possibility. But I didn't have the time or energy, nor was I being invited to do analysis on him, so I didn't bother to do it. But it just occurs to me that sometimes the things we name around race don't have as much to do with race as they have to do with just who we are. And we just put a layer, it's this, it's that, it's something else. Someone was asking me, well, what do you do? A white woman was asking me, what do you do when you try to be nice to somebody black in a grocery store or something, and you speak and they don't speak back? Well, what do you do when white folks don't speak back to you? Because you're just in the grocery store, and sometimes you speak to folks in the grocery store, they don't want to speak to you. And so if they're black, then you don't have to get too bent out of shape about it. It's just a person who didn't feel like speaking that day. Probably it's got nothing to do with the fact that you're a white person. So it's important. It's important to be open, to be conscious, but it's also important to be careful that we don't tell ourselves stories that we don't need to tell ourselves. Because if somebody is abrupt with me in the grocery, somebody I don't know, somebody just passing, maybe race isn't in that encounter. Maybe it's just two human beings that kind of didn't connect to each other. Now, it could be that race is in it, and you have to be careful how many times you don't name it and how many times you do name it. So you stay in that whole dance of how do I look at this, and how do I feel about it? And you have to be careful that you keep some balance so you don't make yourself crazy, because you can be made crazy if you don't watch it. And I think by now you know that I'm not arguing for unconsciousness, but I do think we have to learn how to live in the world and be people of peace, and people who are able to be with each other in ways that can make sense for us. So are we ready to start this? This is another quick little movie, so you have to listen carefully.
Every black female has a big butt and big boobs.
Loud, obnoxious, ghetto.
Light skin being more attractive than dark skin.
We're not smart. We're this way, we're that way. And a lot of times we have to prove ourselves as not being true.
At a young age, I already knew the standards for a girl like me. As I become older, they become more obvious.
You have to have permed hair, relaxed hair.
Straight hair or like blonde hair, long waves or something.
And if it's natural, that's good hair. Like bad hair is hair you have to relax because it's kinky.
Like it's not like appealing to have like natural hairstyles, or like if they are natural, they have to be like the curly head like black girls or something that looks mixed or something.
And I remember when I first started wearing my hair natural, at first my mom was okay with it. And she thought it looked nice. And then after like the second day, she was like, oh, stop that. She was like, you're starting to look African. I was like, well, I am African. And that really pissed me off.
There are standards that are imposed upon us, like
you know, you're prettier if you're light-skinned.
I knew people in the past that just wanted to be light-skinned, not for any particular reason, you know, because they love themselves. I mean, they love themselves except for, you know, the color of their skin.
Like, my siblings are all lighter than me, and my mom, she's dark-skinned, but she's lighter than me. So, like, I noticed, and I was like, hey, how come I'm the darkest? And, you know, everybody else is so light, and I don't know. Since I was younger, I also considered being lighter as a form of beauty, or, you know, beautiful than being dark-skinned. So I used to think of myself as being ugly because I was dark-skinned.
I knew people who actually went out there and got, you know, bleaching cream and everything. They actually laid in the tub, poured capfuls of bleach into it just so they could see if their skin would get lighter.
But yeah, my aunt that lives in Honduras, she basically started using skin bleaching cream when she was about 25. And she started her oldest daughter on it when she was about 11. And then she has an even younger daughter that was about 6 when she started using the skin bleaching cream on her.
I've seen people say that I would never marry a dark-skinned man because, you know, because I don't want that in my gene pool.
On the other hand, light-skinned girls have their issues too. We've been called high yellow, conceited, house nigga. I feel like both sides have their issues.
I guess I sort of felt like there was not any attention towards me because of maybe my skin color or because my hair was kinky or, you know, just basically that. Or even when I was younger, say there was, I don't know, a doll. I used to have a lot of dolls, but most of them were just white dolls with long straight hair that I would comb, and I would be like, oh, I wish I was just like this Barbie doll. In Brown versus Board of Education, the famous case that desegregated schools in the 1950s, Dr. Kenneth Clark conducted a doll test with black children. He asked them to choose between a black doll and a white doll. In most instances, the majority of the children preferred the white doll. I decided to reconduct this test as Dr. Clark did to see how we've progressed since then. Can you show me the doll that you like best or that you'd like to play with?
This one. I like that one.
Okay.
This one.
That one?
This one. I like to play with this.
And can you show me the doll that is the nice doll? And why is that the nice doll?
She's white.
And can you show me the doll that looks bad? Okay. And and why does that look bad?
Because it's black.
And why do you think that's a nice doll?
Because she's white.
And can you give me the doll that looks like you? "15 out of the 21 children preferred the white doll.
Our ancestors came to this country and they were pretty much ripped out of their culture. You know, they couldn't speak their language. They couldn't, you know, they couldn't be themselves. They had to be like what everybody else told them to be.
When you don't know where you're from and you don't know what country you're from, all you know is basically you're from Africa, that's all you're given, I feel like it brings on a lot of ignorance and it builds a lot of anger. I've seen it build a lot of anger in a lot of black young females. I don't know, they feel like because they feel like they have a right to disown any kind of, you know, African roots.
I think for a black girl in general, it's like you're missing a piece of you, you know? And for me, yeah, it's like, oh, I don't have any actual heritage, not heritage, but culture. Like, I know I'm from Africa, but, you know, the different countries in Africa have their different cultures, their different morals, their different values. And not knowing that, it sort of keeps us at a loss. And I feel like we're busy searching for it while everybody else in society is throwing their ideas and what they believe we should be at us. But, you know, personally, we know that's not what we should be, but we're gonna take it because we don't know exactly what it is that we should be, because we don't really know where we came from.
Pretty good for a 16-year-old, huh? To make such a film. So I want to talk a little bit more, and then after, just so you can kind of get a little sense for the direction I'd like us to travel in for the rest of our time together. I'd like you to be thinking about a couple of things. First, what's impacted you the most out of the things we've been talking about and the films and all of that? What's impacted you most today? And what will you do different going forward after you leave this room? What will you do different from what you would have done if you hadn't come here today? Because I do think that when we meet and spend days like this, that it needs to lead us somewhere, wherever. It could be just another thought process, or that you make a commitment to read a book that you thought you needed to read and didn't read. It can be anything, but there needs to be something that it moves us a little further down the road, because that's the whole point of our being together. We're not just trying to, there were a whole bunch of other things you could have done today besides being here. If this isn't going to move you a little further down this road. Earlier today, I said something about my friend David White, who's a phenomenal poet. And if you don't know him, I'd like to invite you to learn about him. One of the things he says that I love so much is that poetry is a language against which there is no defense. And I love that notion, because we can argue about so many things, but you don't argue with the poet usually. Some people might, but you just, mostly you don't. And he's created an image that I love, and the image is being a half a shade braver. The image of being a half a shade braver. So what does it take for us to be a half a shade braver? And when we gather like this for a day of this kind of work and conversation, I always hope that people will leave feeling a half a shade braver. So I would like you to be thinking about that concept of being a half a shade braver, and what action does being a half a shade braver require of you, of what shift, whatever, and what has impacted you the most. So just kind of leave that in your head to be floating around as we talk a little bit here more about internalized depression. I am particularly preoccupied with what will we do in the African American community about internalized depression, because in the first place, I don't think we talk about it enough. I don't think we address it enough in terms of trying to really get at how do we begin to really get well ourselves. And part of that is because we don't want to own it, because we don't want to say we have this injury, because we just want it to be, we want to be all right. But I think for me, the most profound illustration of internalized depression is Black on Black homicide. For me, that is the most profound illustration, because we have been, that message of denigration and devaluation has been sent so much until it's too easy to kill somebody who looks like you. And then everything in the culture reinforces that wasn't such a bad thing, because the punishment's not going to be the same as it would have been if you killed a white person. So we reinforce that. And it's uncomfortable. We don't want to think about it. We don't want to talk about it, but we're going to have to. We're going to have to. And we, all of us who are people of faith, are responsible. It's not just a Black issue. It's a Black-white issue. It's everybody's issue. Young Black people killing themselves in the inner city is everybody's issue. And so it's important for us to be asking ourselves, we need to do something about it besides sitting and wringing our hands and lamenting about it. We need to start really interrogating ourselves about what is this about, and where do we enter into this piece of this issue. I ran a youth violence prevention task force for the mayor of Macon, Georgia, where I lived for a while, and worked with young people and bought their guns back and did a bunch of stuff to try to stem the tide of violence among them, and just discovered a bunch of very young, scared people that we weren't relating to in the ways that we needed to, who had internalized a whole lot of stuff from the culture that was informing them in ways that was creating an inability for them to have any sense of being safe, or really seeing themselves as seeing God in themselves and seeing God in each other. So this business of internalized depression is real and serious and has to be talked about and addressed, and it has to be we have to own it, and that's the part. That's the first step. We in our own community have to own it, and we in the church have to own it, and we in the Episcopal Church. Right now we're after Saturday with Bishop Curry, we're on a whole bunch of people's minds. I think that maybe not so much before Saturday, but he just did us proud. And I was when I get back home tonight, and maybe tonight I'll do it, I'm writing a blog that's called On the Main Stage, because Bishop Curry put Black folks on the main stage. He stood there in the seat of where folks were involved in slavery, and he talked about slaves and Martin Luther King and Jesus. I just thought, wow, how wonderful to have this courageous man stand here and do this and not try to be polite or pretty or whatever, but to tell the truth and to be there in his Black body. That was just so cool. And I'm so grateful. Pardon? Oh, was he? Yeah, I'm not surprised. He'll be everywhere. And there are Episcopalians who have been distressed that we have a Black bishop. And so I hope this will help them get over it. So, and if not, they'll just have 6 more bad years. So, well, we have the same problem in Atlanta. Bishop Robb is the first Black bishop elected in the Diocese of Atlanta, and there are some white Episcopalians who have been distressed that we have a Black bishop, and then they got more distressed when we had a Black presiding bishop. And I guess they weren't too happy about having a Black president. It was just a lot more than they could handle back in the day when Barack was president. But that's all a part of this silly culture that we've got to realize doesn't have anything to do with God. That we've got to work on that. So, and Bishop Robb has gotten some letters from some folks that weren't very nice in regards to some of the things he's done, and some of it's been around race, and that's unfortunate. But those are sisters and brothers that have some things to learn, and God has given them some opportunities, and we just have to keep on trying to be compassionate and stay faithful and help them to understand that, we're all in this together, and they really aren't any better than anybody else, even though they somehow got the wrong message somehow. So, at any rate, I hope that you hear what I'm saying about internalized depression. Internalized depression is a huge issue that has to be opened up to healing, and that God wants to heal as much as anything else. This idea of kind of being not quite as good as, being a little less than, and the culture keeps on reinforcing it, because we denigrate. Any day you walk out in the world as a Black person, you are subject then to all kinds of little digs that we call microaggressions coming at you. I think I was going to talk about my book for a little bit, because the publisher would give me a fit if I go somewhere and don't talk about my book. But I wrote this book called Living into God's Dream, Dismantling Racism in America, which has been out now for going on 2 years, and I would encourage you to take a look at it. It's set up to be a book study, so there's study questions in the back, so you can use it for book studies. A lot of folks have been using it that way, and it's also set up to just read. But I want to read you this little paragraph, a couple paragraphs here, about an experience that my son had that is an example of a microaggression. And micro meaning, as you know, little, and you have these little things that keep happening to you day after day after day. So let me read this, and then I have a couple things to say about that. And this chapter is called Mama, It's So Hard to Be Black in America. And it's a direct quote from him. Mama, it's so hard to be black in America, lamented my oldest son after the Charleston 9 massacre. My son's lament has haunted me ever since. And two experiences during my son and Bai's school years vividly foreshadowed the challenges he would face as a black man. With his Quiz Bowl team near Valdosta, Georgia, he was insulted by a local police officer. Walking with team members back to their hotel, the policeman drove up beside my son and asked, "Do you want some peanuts?" And Bai said, "No." And the cop said, "Well, you should because you look like a monkey." Frightened by the comment, Bai began running back to the hotel. He was in middle school, so he was 13. On another occasion, one of his teachers criticized Bai and one of his classmates for their African names. She thought their names had been contrived in some manner, instead of realizing that both children were native-born Africans. My son was born in Gambia and his friend in Nigeria. In both cases, I demanded that the adults involved write letters of apology. In both cases, the children were surprised that an offending adult had been held accountable and that their insult and injury had not gone unnoticed. My insistence was to help the children involved realize that they are not powerless in the face of racism. So when I told Bai, my son, that I called the sheriff in the town where this deputy had insulted him, and I called to make a complaint. And my son said to me, "Well, Mama, I don't know why you waste your time doing that, because it's just not going to make any difference." And I said, "Well, it might not, but I'm doing it." And so about 7 or 8, the sheriff said, "Well, what do you want me to do? You know, do you want him to call and talk to him?" And I said, "No, I want him to write him a letter of apology." Because he's got, writing is better than calling, because you get to call and you talk 2 seconds and it's over. You got to think about this letter, and then my son can keep the letter and be reminded, like the Israelites used to build those little tabernacles at places where they met God. I wanted him to know that on this journey, he has met places where resistance mattered in this business, because otherwise you get to be an older person not really thinking that you can resist this kind of stuff. So he was pretty sure that I had just wasted my time. But about 7 or 8 days later, he got his letter from the sheriff. So he came home from school, and I gave him the letter, and he looked at it, because he wasn't used to getting mail. He looked at it, and then he looked at where it was from, and he looked at me, and he looked back at the letter, and he looked at me again, and he just started grinning. And he was so shocked. And he opened the letter, and it was this wonderful apology, and the sheriff sent him a badge, a cotton badge, a souvenir badge. And so with the teacher, she's making fun of these children's names. Now, what teacher should be making fun of any child's name ever? And doing it in where other children heard her. That's how they learned about it, because the other children came and said she was making fun of their names. My son's name is Mbye, M-B-Y-E. His friend's name is Onechi. Onechi's Nigerian. My son is Gambian. And so when I went to speak to her, she said, well, when she saw them again at Quiz Bowl practice, she would apologize. And I said, "No, ma'am, you have to write to them. Because you see, you've done something that has to be noted in a concrete, unforgettable, clear manner. And you can make a half-hearted verbal apology or whatever, but if it's written down, they get to see it clearly." So she wrote them. And I imagine that the next time she wants to talk about a kid, she might remember that it's not a good idea, And it's these ways of saying microaggressions have got to be acknowledged and dealt with, particularly for your children. And then you need to do some of it for yourself as well. As an adult, I can make some choices now about, there are 200 microaggressions in a day. How many of them, how much energy am I going to give to them? And I pay attention to some of them, and some of them I just don't pay attention. I mean, I see it, but I'm going on my way. Because I'm not going to let my life be run by those things external to me. And you have to be careful about that. If you don't watch it, do you understand? You give your life over to being kind of reacting to this stuff rather than thinking, okay, I've got some bottom lines, and if you cross that line, then I've got to do something. But up until then, I'm going to kind of let it go, because there's just so much stuff every day. And some people don't have the filters for processing like that, so the microaggressions become more than they can handle, and it can lead to depression and immobilization. A lot of times when you look at people and wonder why they don't do things, it may be that if you had to walk in their shoes for a few hours, it would be clearer what was going on. It takes a good bit of energy and fortitude to process this, and then to find how you're going to deal with it. So some stuff needs to be dealt with in a straightforward kind of way. In the case of my son, that was far more about him than me. If somebody had said that to me, I might not have even bothered. There's a possibility that I wouldn't have. But my child needed to know that he was not put on the earth to be treated that way. And it was up to me to see to him getting that message, because he needed to go into adulthood with this sense of himself, his sense of self-worth. And that kind of stuff undermines your self-worth after a while. Too many of those things happen, and after a while you lose. That's internalized depression. So I'm talking about this so much because I don't think that we don't talk about it ever, and we don't get it. And we just think that, I've had folks say to me, well, racism, we've made these laws and stuff, and everything's pretty okay now, so why are you how does racism really manifest itself in the 21st century? This is part of how, with these microaggressions and this kind of, I don't know, I think every person of color in the room could give a list, I'm pretty sure, of examples of how many times in a day, and many times from very well-meaning people who just are asleep and don't know what they're doing, don't know what they're saying. And we need to call them on however much of it we have the energy for. But I'm always going to be rallying for making sure that you stay in charge of yourself, that you don't let outside things determine what kind of person you're going to be. Like somebody who never speaks and they're just hateful, you can quit speaking and be hateful like them, or you can keep speaking and let them be hateful to you. And if you keep speaking, you're saying, this is who I am, whether you speak or not, I speak, right? I'm not speaking just because you speak to me. I'm speaking because that's what I do. I'm being kind because that's what I do, and not what I get back. I mean, you wouldn't want to go trying to cook dinner and invite them to your house, but you wouldn't also want them to be controlling your behavior. And it's easy to give yourself over to other people in your head and literally, and you have to watch out for that. Remember, I started out this morning talking about the inner community, and it's always important to make sure how your inner community is functioning. And it's up to you to see to that. You are the gatekeeper into your inner community. Yes, sir.
Microaggression is something that we've all heard ridiculed, and because sometimes it's taken to an extreme that almost feels silly, the kind of thing you would ignore, for example. But I minister right now in a predominantly African-American parish, and I once asked them, because I came from the mostly white parish in the same town before I retired. So I once asked why, when we had combined services, was it hard to get black people over to St. Andrew? Mm-hmm. I understood the other way. I understood it, but I didn't understand this one. And the answer was microaggression. So I believe that we need to understand this more, and I'm asking if we could get some really good examples. For example, a microaggression from preaching would be a really helpful example.
So let me make sure I understand what you just said. You are in a predominantly African-American parish, and you're trying to get them to go to a predominantly white parish to visit?
I was asking to understand why is it, we worked for many years to have combined events.
With a white parish and a black parish. Uh-huh.
That's when I was in the white parish. We worked really hard to have those combined events, and it was like pulling teeth. There was no animosity. It was very pleasant, but nobody wanted to do it on either side, and I was trying to understand it. And I know the answer was microaggressions, that sometimes you want to just be safe in your church. You don't want to put up with the person who's going to, the kind white person who's going to piss you off.
Right.
And I know that that's what microaggression is referring to. And that's why I think that this group really needs to understand the concept and have a few examples. If I could ask you to dig in.
Well, one example, one of my friends is a graduate of Wesleyan College in Macon, where I held an endowed chair. And she was at the alumni, one of the alumni weekend events, and this white woman asked her to take her dishes after she had finished eating, because she assumed my friend was part of the help because she's black. And there's only, Wesleyan didn't have a whole lot of black graduates, so anybody black in that gathering had to be working, not an alum of Wesleyan. And so my friend, who's got this really great wit, and she thinks much faster than I on her feet, and so she just was kind of, quipping back to her, well, I don't do dishes, or some smart aleck thing, and then, but I'll find somebody to help you. And, but the assumption that you are the help. And at the other day, one of my friends who's an organist and has played concerts at the Cathedral of St. Philip's in Atlanta came to an event at St. Philip's in the afternoon, and someone thought he was the sexton, referred to him, asked him something that was intended for the sexton. And so when he said, I don't work here, then the person said, well, he looked like that person, which we doubt is the case. He probably didn't look like that person. He looked like him because he was black, I think, because the sexton's black and you're black. So, and everybody knows we kind of all look alike, right? So if you see one of us, you've seen all of us. So as far as preaching, I don't know. I think that, it depends on what kind of examples you use in a sermon. One would need to be careful about using some kinds of examples. Somebody's hand up somewhere to help me with. Oh, okay. I just think that sensitivity to that. I mean, I don't know about that particular piece. Yes, sir. Stand up, please, so people can hear you better.
I think most of us can spot out microaggressions when they come from race, because color, they make us feel uncomfortable. I'm Hispanic. I got a lot of microaggressions based on language and language spoken.
Yes.
I've sat in so many conversations when we talk about the future of church, where we're going, and the conversation almost always goes to, eventually they'll speak English. And
eventually
they'll speak English. Yeah. And for the end of a strategy conversation on including Latinos into a church, to go is, we'll just get to the point until the children are speaking English, and then everything will be better. It's like, wow, you're just going to bank on us eventually becoming more like you.
Right.
And that really hurts, and most people don't realize that thinking of Hispanic ministry that way is very painful to those who speak that language.
Thank you. That's incredibly good. And to be to not be cognizant of people, that's the language, and they may probably speak it till they die, rather than waiting for them to get over it. Yes, Jabril.
I was thinking of something a little more abstract, because then we can apply some
of the various range of tangible examples. And so the thing that came to mind is anything that has, especially as a white male, that you would be indignant about. But as a person of color, you know you cannot be indignant about, even if you want to. Let's forget about choice. You can choose to be indignant or not want to be indignant or whatever. But as a white person, you have an option to be indignant about. That as a person of color, you do not have the option of being indignant about. You suffer that as a microaggression. It's something that other people can say, hey, you know what, I'm not really bothered by that. But if you were the person that wanted to be bothered by that, you could be. But as a person of color, whether I want to be bothered by it or not, I can't be. I have to be silent and just take it.
There's also compliments like a person is articulate.
Yeah.
Or, gee, I don't hear any accent in your voice. They're meant to be compliments.
Yeah, I always like to say if somebody dares to tell, you all can pay me any kind of compliments you want to pay me. Let me say that first. But if somebody dares to tell me that I'm articulate, I'll say, well, you know, that doesn't surprise me because I have a PhD from Emory, you know. And they don't actually give degrees out there. You really have to work for them, you know. So, and I don't know why it should surprise anybody else. I mean, you know, so it's right up there with your credit to your race, you know, that kind of comment. I saw somebody's hand somewhere. Yes, sir. Stand up, please.
The parish that I am in is primarily Caribbean, and we have a couple African Americans. The rector and I, he's gone now, but we understand that there's different experiences between the two cultures.
Yes.
And I know Father Jabril, I have heard that you told a story, Father, about your experience as a black person in the United States being pulled over. You know, my experience has been the Caribbeans don't want to talk about that stuff. You know, I mean, you know, it's like, you know, we're a mixed parish, but we don't talk about it. You know, it's like we all get along, but you know, we're not going to really talk about you're black and I'm white, which is one of the reasons I'm here, obviously. Okay, so all I'm trying to say is that my impression, my experience has been there's a different culture of racism, and I write about that between the African American experience through slavery. The Caribbeans had slavery, but they if you talk to them about it, well, that was a long time ago. You know, they don't, you know, they seem to be disconnected. I don't know. I'm just tossing it out.
Well, one thing, I don't want to speak for, there are folks here, I think, from the Caribbean in the room who can speak. But one of the things that I want to say is that, for the most part, we of African descent started on the continent. And some of us got left in the Caribbean, and some of us got brought here. And things were not the same in every place. But if you show up in North America, if you show up in the United States, then your skin's just black.
I will say this. Somebody, the senior warden was telling me this. She said there's a different experience from when they've been in Canada and England. She did tell me this, that she's experienced the racism in the United States. She did not experience in Canada or England. I will say that.
Well, when the cop stops you, they don't try to ask you where you were born. They just see a black person. And whatever the dynamic is operating in them is what comes to bear. Now, I do think that if you have a different sense about yourself, that can help you navigate some of the stuff we're talking about in a different way with a different spirit about it. But in this country, I do think that if you don't pay attention to the structures being what they are here, that maybe is something that folks are missing out on understanding where they are, because nobody's going to ask you for your passport. The cop doesn't ask you for your passport when they stop you. They just stop you and your face is black. And you are then subject to what any other black person is subject to in that regard. Now that later on, the other stuff might come into play. And I think it's really important for us in the church to be careful that we don't allow there to be this sense of some people here better than others and better off than others because we're really here together. And so how you get at that, I don't really know. I mean, I don't have a formula for it, but I just do think it's important.
I could just share this. 3 years ago, I went to Liberia, okay? So I had the reverse experience. And in Liberia, there's checkpoints, okay? So I'm in the car with Liberians, all right, but at the checkpoints, I'm the one getting eyeballed, okay? And at least twice, they wanted me to show my passport, right? And I can't tell you what that experience was like. From that, you know, it was like...
Well, it's not something that white people have to think about in America because, as you saw in the film earlier today, you don't actually have to think about being white. You don't have to think about it because white is the norm, white is reality, and so you kind of go through your life thinking about other stuff, and until somebody calls your attention to, oh yeah, you know, it's hard to talk about. Sometimes when this group's too big for this, but sometimes when I do small groups of dismantling racism work, after we watch the Tim Wise film, we talk together. The white people in the room have to answer the question, what is whiteness? And we have more silence in that section of the work that day than any other time in the day because it's not even a question that has been engaged. So it'd be a good question to engage just for as you go forward from this place, to journal about, to think about, to talk together with somebody else about. Because what we end up doing is always being able to kind of look at whiteness in regards to whiteness is the norm and then everything else has to fit. Well, if you take away all those things that fit, who are you as a white person? It's sort of like trying to ask yourself, who am I if I don't define myself as somebody's mother, somebody's wife, somebody's father, somebody's sister, somebody's aunt? If I take all of that stuff away, who am I? And that's an important question to be able to answer. And it's important to be able to answer what is whiteness as well. So, and those are just things to think about going forward. So, I don't have any better examples about microaggressions. I think you can ask the folks that you're in community with, what are some of their experiences and what are the things that are offensive to them. I think that can be a really good conversation because they would be able to talk about specific things that really impact them. Yes, ma'am, and then yes, sir.
You write in your book about microaggression, and then you read us those two examples.
Mm-hmm.
And from where I sit with my white face, that doesn't feel like microaggression.
Mm-hmm.
That feels like aggression. You have a child being bullied by a man in a uniform.
Yeah.
And a child being bullied by a teacher. That's not micro. That's not sort of, oh, I like the way you worded that. That's like right in your face.
Mm-hmm.
But I think from where I sit with my white face, I see it that way. And maybe where you sit, that's just what we deal with.
Mm-hmm. It is.
And I'm sorry to hear that.
Thank you. I appreciate your empathy about that. There are so many more levels of aggression in a day, and these things don't rise to that level, even though they're horrible. So you get you end up grading it in a way, and that's because you have to, because you got to figure out how to live, and we can't be immobilized and live in a way that you just got to figure out how to live in the world that you happen to be in. Yes, sir.
Yes, ma'am. I want to argue a contention here that white people don't experience that aggression. My dad was colonel in the Air Force, retired, but we lived in a town that was predominantly Hispanic. I dated a Hispanic girl, and we were surrounded by Native Americans. I was run out of school with knives, chains, and guns because I was white. I was a gringo. I got shot at when I went to see my friends on the res But I'm going to tell you what, I didn't have that aggression to them. But we create those aggressions against each other. And I don't want to put it to black, white, Hispanic, whatever. We all face those microaggressions because of our culture and the cultures that we're brought up in. So one doesn't play against the other. It is an equal opportunity thing that we experience. And I experienced. And I learned a lot from it. When I got stationed in Europe, the first thing they said was, you are a guest in their country. And try not to make them like you are.
Yeah.
So I want to just express why I've experienced that microaggression. I grew up with it in my formative years.
Right.
So it doesn't apply just to one race, one color, whatever. It's a cultural thing that we apply to all cultures.
It applied to you because you happen to be in a Hispanic community. But if your parents had moved you away from that community, then you could have been free of it. If you were a person of color, there is nowhere to go.
It depends on your socioeconomics too.
Well, but my point is that as a black person, as a person of color, there's nowhere to go to escape that. And as a white person, even though it happened in your case, which I'm sorry that it happened to you, but as a white person, you don't have to experience microaggressions in the same way as an adult as a black person, or even those Native people or brown people who were doing that to you. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yes, Jabril.
Just to piggyback right there, I was thinking the better you are socially, the better social class you are as a person of color, the more likely you are to experience microaggressions. So it kind of has an inverse relationship. Because, living in my white neighborhood, I get the cops calling on me regularly. But if I may add something for your point, brother, about this microaggression, maybe if we look beyond microaggression, I think it was stories from our fraternity. Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, the fraternity of Dr. King and Paul Wilkes, and I can go on down the list. I won't go down the list of our famous men that was Alpha Phi Alpha. But the first white member of Alpha Phi Alpha spoke at one of our conventions a couple of years ago, back in '09, and he was talking about how he ended up becoming a member of the fraternity. This was in '54. This was before Brown versus Board of Education in Kansas. Woo! And so he talked about how he was a Lutheran youth worker on campus, and he was trying to integrate campus clubs. And he had one black friend who happened to be a member of the fraternity, and he goes to him and he says, I don't understand why it is that I'm trying to integrate, I'm trying to get black folks to come out, and no one will come. What is it? Which is the basis of the question that you were asking. And the response that our fraternity brother said was, why is it that when you white folks want to do integration, it's always about us joining your stuff? And to that he was convicted, and then he became a member of Alpha Phi Alpha. So as we look in this room of largely white folks with largely white congregations, this work is going to look something like that, I would imagine.
Right. Yeah. Well, and one thing that I really want to say, and then we're moving on from this part of the discussion, is that the work of deconstructing borders and being liberated has to be done no matter where you are. If your parish is all white, then you still got the same work to do. And you just have to be more creative about how to get it done. One of our priests in the Diocese of Atlanta told me that one time he committed himself to a year of reading only literature by people of color as a part of his own self-liberating work. So proximity is really good and wonderful, and is very helpful. But if you don't have proximity, you still have responsibility. And so you have to figure out, you have to be creative. And what I think is that when we put our toe in the Red Sea, that the water parts. So when we take a step toward liberation and waking up and not being unconscious, that God takes 5 steps to meet us. And we don't ever know what doors will open, because God can open doors on walls that we didn't even see a door. And so, but we do have to be willing to put our toe in the water. And that I've seen that over and over about many things, and I think it's true about this. So if you happen to be in a predominantly white or an all-white congregation thinking, how in the world could we ever start with this? You can start. You start somewhere. You start little. You don't go in telling people to read necessarily Malcolm's autobiography. You know, you might want to start with Brian Stevenson, Just Mercy. You will start somewhere that makes sense, and then build on it, because the idea is to invite people into the conversation. It's not to run people down the road and have them hide out somewhere. And in order to do that, you have to have some reasonableness about a starting place. Yes, sir.
One of the forms of racism that I've noticed, and particularly in my own family, and have caught myself doing it, is that when you have an encounter, a positive encounter, particularly with a person of color, and then you go back and you talk about that encounter to other people in your family or whatever, you point out that person's skin color. I was talking to that black guy down the street. He's really nice, and I like, and so you know, and I caught that, and my wife and I had this conversation. We said, why would we ever come back and tell a story and have to? Why is it significant to know the person's skin color? Sometimes it is. There's a particular reason. So I have caught now family members doing that a lot, and we've committed to saying, why would we do this? We need to stop that. That's racist. And then so I've kind of committed to, when I hear somebody do that, to saying, so tell me what's significant about the fact that they were black or Hispanic, and just ask them, and it kind of opens up the conversation. It's like white people don't realize that they do that.
Right. Thank you. That's a very good example of a tiny step of waking up and kind of opening up the conversation in a way, and maybe even leading into a deeper conversation at some point. Yes, sir.
Back after the shootings up in Charleston, my parish and another white parish got together with 2 black parishes. Mm-hmm. And we decided what we would commit to was that we try and have every 5th Sunday, we'd have lunch together. And the first time we got together, we had probably 150 people join together. It was funny because we did it for at least a year and a half to 2 years. And what I noticed over the period of time, the numbers would go up and go down and up and down. But that the folks that kept on coming back, and in this case, we didn't have the black folks come to the white community. We had white folks go to the black community always. Because we felt like that was what we needed to do, and we were the ones that started. But what I realized was that the ones that kept on coming back were the ones who wanted to have a relationship. I mean, plain and simple. It wasn't, did you offend me, did you not offend me? There was discussions going on all over. So we rarely had an agenda. We just sat down and ate. And the first one was 150 because I think we served really good food that day. But after that, the food was less important, the relationships. And then when we ended it, at least from the white community, most of those folks that wanted to build community, out of my parish I can name 25 people. They began to work in the black community at the Black Heritage Museum, Boys and Girls Club, Police Athletic League, the Community Garden. And it was a transformation for individuals, but it was all relational. It wasn't a question of, did you offend me, did I say it right, it had nothing to do with it. It had to do with, did we have a desire to build a relationship? And if you have a desire to build a relationship, then something happens.
Well, and it's true for any human relationship. We're forgiving, right? Because we have to forgive our friends all the time if we want to have any friends, because there's always going to be somebody doing something that you wish they hadn't done. And so I'm sorry is a part of everybody's vocabulary, I think. Yes, sir.
I want to tell you a story. Many years ago, I was fortunate enough to spend a lot of time on the island of Barbados, an old surfer. And I love people. You too, huh, bro?
No, calm down. That's evasion.
I love evasion friends. But this one young man that I knew became a really talented surfer, and was able to win the national championships a couple of times. And I got invited to surf in a professional event in California. So he'd never been to America, and he had never experienced some of the things that we're discussing today. He lived in a fairly insular community, a little town called Bathsheba. So somehow he got the money. I kicked my loan into some money. He didn't have a job. Unemployment was a real issue down there. He flew to California, and before the pro event, he went to arguably the most famous surfing beach in the continental United States, a place called Malibu. Some of us have heard of it. So that's the beach closest to where all the Hollywood starlets and movie stars and everybody goes. So you can get a sense of what that beach culture was like. So he walks down the beach, he's carrying a surf. This guy is built. He is a good-looking man. He's very fit, carries a very strong presence about him. He's walking down the beach and he hears all these catcalls. Everybody's saying things to him and jeering at him. And, what are you doing here? Well, it made him mad. He said he was telling the story, and so he paddled out in the water, and he was so upset and frustrated by that he totally blew every other surfer out of the water. They couldn't even come anywhere near what he was doing. When he finished, he went back on the beach, and he said the same people that were jeering at him were running up to him. Who are you? How did you? I've never seen anybody surf like that before. On and on and on. And so the point was that he was still the same person, but he had done something that really kind of punched that, if you want to say racist community on the beach right in the face, and they had to process that. What do we do with this individual that can do something we can't do? So that in itself is food for thought, and it leads me to consider with microaggressions and even macroaggressions that folks of color deal with. What about sports? I mean, I see so many African American athletes and athletes of dark skin around the world that do very well, and they're idolized and they're paid a lot of money. How do you understand that?
Well, it's sort of like a pet. It's like a pet. Because it doesn't matter how you treat me because you think I'm so important and being in proximity to me makes you somehow better, then I'm okay. It's how do you treat me when you don't have that projection? And so it's like you keep the way you keep your pets in a way. I mean, that's sort of the relationship we have with celebrity. If you're a celebrity, celebrities could always do stuff that black celebrities could not always, but many times do things that other black people couldn't do. It used to be that if you were from a foreign country and you were black, you got treated a little better, like trying to drive across country. You could stay in a hotel when an African American couldn't stay in a hotel. So that element of celebrity, which is just another way of denigration, really. So I don't see that as a plus. I see that as a negative. I see that as a part of the whole process of denigration. You're in South Africa, they used to have what they call honorary white people. They let some black people be honorary white people, that you could get honorary status and you could go to the hospital or something. So we kind of have that. That's kind of what that is. You're honorary. And don't go too far with it. Because if you go too far, we'll put you back in your place.
I kind of look at the professional sports, for example. You've got teams, largely angler types, that have billions of dollars to throw in sports that pay enormous amounts of money to their athletes. That dynamic makes me uncomfortable a little bit. I mean, it is business, and they have the money; they can do with it what they want. But I think what you're saying really kind of rings true. I just don't see where in popular culture there is a really obvious breakthrough in dealing with these embedded racisms and aggression, and microaggression, passive-aggressive aggression, and all that. I wonder if you could address perhaps some places where we're actually doing pretty well with that.
Well, I don't know how we're doing in this country. I think we're doing pretty poorly, if you ask me, about a lot of stuff. I think that they're probably, in terms of just like if you want to try to say in this arena, that arena, we've done away with racism. We haven't. We act a little nicer because we have some laws that say you have to do this. But we've been, ever since we passed those laws, we've been working diligently to see what we can do to undermine them. So I think that I don't think we're doing too well in terms of just the real spirit of equity, to really want to just stop worrying about where people of color are. I think look at what's happening at the present moment in our nation and the attitudes that are there. Now, I do understand that those attitudes don't represent, those attitudes don't represent everybody. If I thought they did, I'd be in much worse shape than I am right now. But they represent too many people. And just all this stuff, this backlashy stuff that's going on with people calling cops for nonsense things around black people. I think that all that stuff is a sign of the work we have to do. And so I think we're in trouble as a nation, and that we as Christians have a responsibility to be the leaders in leading us out of that trouble. That's how I feel. And I don't know that makes you feel any better, but that is how I feel. So
part of my question would be, what about with grade school age kids that are growing up together, multi-races, they're friends, they don't have these embedded prejudices built into them mostly.
Yeah. Well, when they get to be middle school, they'll find them. So, yeah. I mean, we have made changes in this country. There are many things in this country that are better than they were. We're all in this room here together. There was a time in this country when that wouldn't be the case. But in terms of trying to look for some wholesale way that we're going down a better road, we're not there yet. Because the young people can be just as bad as the old people. Some folks have the notion if we just let all the old people die and we have a new generation. Well, when the new generation has learned what the old generation has taught them on both sides of the coin. And so we still have to deal with that. And so we just got work to do. I mean, that's all it is to it. We just got work to do. And yeah, their kids do a lot of stuff together, but people have been doing a lot of stuff together for a long time. But the systems are as intact as they ever were. And there is a commitment to the maintenance of those systems that we have to keep on chopping away at. And so, and until we start looking at it that way, the work is just out there in front of us. Can you stand up, please?
Resegregating our schools, the model we have of people coming together in schools, that's just not happening. Now, I can tell you in Brevard County, I see it playing out in the way that across the nation, just statistically, more children now are being taught in single, predominantly one ethnic group schools than any time since the 1950s and even before that. Yeah. So it's not going in the direction of young people, children actually getting to meet with each other. Actually, we're doing moving them further and further apart.
Well, we've done a whole lot of trying to go backwards because I began this morning talking about fear, and there is a prevailing fear of equality. I don't exactly know all of what that's about, but there's this kind of fear that what would be wrong with a country where we just were really all okay and equally able to do what we needed to do and have things just move along without all of the gotta have this hierarchy and that hierarchy and some other hierarchy. But most of us don't want that. Most of us want somebody to be up and somebody not to be quite as up. And we have to interrogate ourselves about that and decide when we're going to be willing to let go of it. Yes, sir. Can stand up. They can't hear you back there.
Now, thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yeah.
There's this myth of scarcity of resource.
Yes.
That God does not provide what we have. Therefore, we've got to take more, take it away from someone else, so that we'll have more, and we elevate ourselves by stepping on them.
Right. Yeah.
And I think it's all based on fear because we're not perfected in love.
Well, I think that we who call ourselves Christians have to be the ones at whose door we lay this stuff and tell ourselves, okay, what are we going to do about that? Because we have that scarcity mentality in the church. and it needs to be gotten rid of. Yes, sir.
I don't typically stand up at these things, but I'm just trying to be a shade braver.
A half a shade braver, okay.
I hope that we're all more proud of our presiding bishop and also of being followers of Christ after Thursday night, when our presiding bishop will be at service in Washington, D.C., and will be going to the White House and protest against some of the things about immigration that are going on in America today.
Yeah, well. And also the Episcopal Church is joined with Reverend Barber and the Poor People's Campaign. I don't know if you know that, but that's a very important thing. I want to switch gears now and go back to the two things I asked you about before, because we don't have much time left. I do appreciate the questions and the interaction, and I've talked a lot today, and I hope that it's not just cause your brain cells to die. I want what's impacted you the most today, and what thing do you need to do to be a half a shade braver? And this gentleman has already said what he stood up to speak, and he's being a half a shade braver. So how can you be moved? How are you moved to be a half a shade braver? And if we could have some people speak who haven't spoken, I would love to hear some other voices raised in the room as well. Do you understand what I'm asking? I just want to make sure you're clear about what I'm asking, so you don't have to be confused about that. Yes, ma'am.
I think I have a understanding of where I can be a half a shade braver, and that I do recognize that I live in a world of privilege, but as a woman, I still experience different microaggressions. For example, I experience in our parish sometimes, Father Tom is Father Tom, and I'm Miss Tracy.
Right.
And that's something that sometimes I have the energy to deal with, and sometimes I don't.
Right.
But I, because I've experienced it, can perceive when other people are doing that, and sometimes I let that slide, because again, I have said, well, I've got other things I need to focus on right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think my bravery can be a stance of going, maybe that is what I need to focus on right now, and that thing that I thought was important to do isn't the thing right now.
Right. I think it is important for people to call you Reverend, the same as the man in the church, and to understand that God didn't create the hierarchy, you know? I think folks don't quite get that sometimes. Yes, ma'am.
I'm just I'm so aware. I've lived in this country for quite a lot of years, over 20 years, but as someone from England, I'm so aware that I don't know so much, and there's so much I don't know that I don't know. And so I know that I hold back sometimes because I'm afraid of making a fool of myself, not quite knowing what to say, not knowing who the person is that everybody's talking about. There's a part of your history and I don't even know who they are. I feel ignorant, and so, but I realize that what I've done is I've let that fear hold me back instead of saying, yeah, well, I've been granted some intelligence, I can read, I can learn that. The piece about the Constitution, I have no awareness of that. So I think the steps, what you've given me, is that there is something I can do. I can continue to educate myself, and I can continue to be vulnerable and to go towards people and say, please help me. You know, help me. I'm curious. I want to learn. I want to grow. How do we do this? I mean, I'm in a community which is a divided community. I guess that's even a foolish thing to say, because what is and which community isn't. But I have no idea. I don't know the dickens what I'm doing now. So, but I know that I'm supposed to be there. So I thank you for just that impartation of it's okay to not know, and it's okay to just trust that the mysticism, God is up to something with us as a community, the divided community that we are in. It'll just kind of keep going forward. So I appreciate that.
And I want to thank you so much. And I would invite you to our website, and we have a whole list of books there that you can read and films that you can watch. I would invite all of you to our website. There's a list of resources at our website, as well as a couple of book studies that we've worked out that have been done on books that we've done already that you certainly are welcome to take advantage of and to download or whatever, you know. So yes, you could. I would invite any of you to come to Atlanta. Just let me know ahead of time so I can make sure I'm not off somewhere doing a clergy day. because I'm not always there, but we'd love to have you come and visit. And who's going to General Convention in here? So we sent out invitations to a lunch we're hosting at General Convention, so we'd love to have you join us for that lunch to go make a reservation. And we're also going to have a couple of conversations on race at General Convention, and we'd love to have you come to that. Yes, sir, go ahead.
I know I spoke earlier, but one of the things for me, for everyone here, when we have these conversations, it's often black, white, and didn't mention the Puerto Ricans earlier. There's also language issues, and people like me, I'm a minority. I present white, and sometimes that gives me privilege because I can blend in places that others cannot. And it also, because I present white, a lot of my colleagues say horrible things around me that they wouldn't say if I look brown. In our churches, we have interracial couples, and we often think about this as a black-white dynamic. And if we so uphold the sanctity of marriage, what are we doing in our churches to build up those individuals who are in mixed marriages? We can think about these things theoretically and say, I'm going to commit to do something about it, but it's here and now. And I heard someone maybe say it's not happening in grade school. We just welcomed in thousands of Puerto Ricans and children who've never been in a mixed race environment. I am sitting with them at our churches who've just arrived from the Caribbean, and they're expressing to us racism they've experienced now that they've never experienced in their lives before. So I'm sorry, I don't buy it that the younger generations aren't doing it. And I don't buy it that because we don't see it, because we don't see it, it doesn't exist. Right. And then the other thing I don't buy is this notion that racists are mean people, so when we're in a car, oh, they're nice. They can't possibly be racist. I know a lot of nice racists. Yeah. I know a lot of really, really nice racists who will bring you food. But that is the really bad nature of bias. It doesn't always present in a way we think it would present.
So one of the things I want to say to you in response to the whole business about Latino, we have not done our work as a church to create materials and to do right by the Latinos in this country, as well as all of Province 9, which is the Latin American province. And so the Center for Racial Healing is working on trying to take some tiny steps in that direction. We've created a curriculum for 6th to 12th graders, and that in English, and that curriculum has been handed over to one of our Latino priests to read and tell us how to make it culturally sensitive for Latino people. We're not just translating it into Spanish and saying, here, take this and go use it. I've also sent it to Honduras, to Bishop Allen to read, because his assessment to me is that for people in Latin America, for Latinos in Latin America, the experience is different from Latinos in North America, and some of the nuances would be different. So we're taking some tiny steps toward trying to say, let's stop pretending these folks are not part of the church, and stop this kind of ignoring them or treating them as second-class and third-class citizens. Now, I don't know how to speak Spanish yet, but I'm working on getting myself in gear to learn enough so that I can let folks know that I know Spanish is a real language. And I just think that our attitudes need to shift. And we focused a lot on black-white because the black-white construct is such a huge one, but it does not, in my heart, does not mean that the Latino and Native American and Asian American, to maybe a little lesser degree, are things that we have to be equally as committed to. And if we begin to open up our heads about any piece of it, we can open up our heads about all of it. And we just really have to stop. I just learned of a few days ago about a parish that has a community of people from, I think, an African country, and they who worship in their building. No, they're native. Are they native peoples? No, they're from the Congo. That's where they are from. And so this church has decided that the people have been meeting in their building in the same sanctuary. This is an Episcopal church. And they've decided that they were going to have the folks meet in the basement, and they were going to create a separate entrance for them to come into. And so they won't have, they can, because they thought the people would somehow be more comfortable. I'm not making this up. I mean, I just learned about this a few weeks ago. And so the interesting and wonderful thing was that the bishop was like on the table saying, not in this diocese, this is not happening. But to think that these good people thought that that was a remedy for this, for something. I mean, on what universe are you operating that you consider this to be a remedy for anything, that you're going to have folks come into a separate entrance into the basement, and yet you're being this gracious, offering hospitality to these folks and these, so we just got lots of work to do, because they really they're still working on trying to understand why that's a problem. And they mean well. I mean, they really do mean well. Yes, sir.
One other group in that I think is probably the one group in the society now that is most approved, discriminated against. And with a mother who's named Muhammad, Muslims. Yeah. And I hear people say things about Muslims that they said about any other racial group or any other group, it probably results in either being told off or even arrested.
Right. Well, we pick who we want to other. And so, we othered black folks. It's sort of not, you can't do that the same kind of way you can other some other people now. And we use immigration. That's sort of like a code word for othering brown people and all the junk we're saying. We're just making the Latino people into the new group of folks to be othered, and Muslims too. And but see, what I want to say is, no matter what the culture does, Christians have a different standard. Because the empire and the church just ain't the same thing. So when folks are out here saying stuff about Muslims, it's our job to say, you don't get to say that to me. You don't get to say that to me. You don't get to malign any group of people. You don't tell me any jokes. Don't say anything in my presence that denigrates another human being. Period. I don't care who you are, and if you do it, I will call you on it and let you know that that's unacceptable. Because if you want to tell me a funny joke, let it be on yourself. If you want to denigrate somebody, let it be on you. Don't pick some group of people or some off color. Some people listen to jokes. I mean, and sometimes people catch you off guard because they say stuff, and it takes you a minute to even process that they said it, and you don't quite know what to say because you're just still trying to process it. But there's some things you have to get straight in your head ahead of time. And the thing ahead of time for me is, don't talk to me in a negative way about somebody, about another person, in a denigrating kind of way, because my little antenna just going to stay up about that. Yeah.
I can't remember where I heard this. I think it was maybe from a comedian, but I think they said that anytime someone told like a joke that was even subtly racist, they would play dumb like they didn't get it, and then ask the person who told the joke to actually explain why it was funny to them. It really put them in an awkward position.
Yeah. Sometimes asking questions is a really good thing. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. Way in the back.
I'm from Philadelphia. Go Eagles. Anyway, my son, when he was in high school outside of Philly, he came home one day really upset. And I said, "What's the matter, Christopher?" And he said, "Mom, I wish I was all Italian and not half Arab and half Italian." Because some people, somebody or a group of kids got his locker and they spray painted on it, F.U. Arab, and a big print underneath it, killer. And I got so upset, I went to the high school. Luckily, it was right across the street from where I lived. And I went to talk to the principal, and he said to me, well, Mrs. Havers, that was my name. You don't, it's just kids. You don't have to worry about it. I said, I don't have to worry about it. I said, I'm raising my son to be proud of his heritage. I said, my son's great-grandfather was the first Syrian Orthodox priest in Philadelphia. I said, I am raising him to be proud of his heritage, as well as to be a good American. And I said, and I want that off of his locker before tomorrow morning. And he said, well, the sexton went home. I said to him, you have a bucket, you have cleanser, you get it all. And I stood there and watched him clean my son's locker.
All right. I think she got me beat. Yeah. 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 So that's more than a half a shade braver. That's pretty brave. Yes, ma'am.
I have two takeaways. I just want to say I want to talk to you, but then people won't hear me. But
go ahead.
The two takeaways for me today. One is I've been in the healing ministry for over 20 years, and I've always said it. I have a heart for racial reconciliation. But today you gave me new language for racial healing, and I love that much more. And that's a new language for me to go forward to have that heart. And in my congregation we have Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, and we all love each other. And there it doesn't seem to be that there's racial divisions among us. But the other piece too, I live in a little historic town called Enterprise, and our church has been there since 1884. It's on the National Registry of Historic Places, and I do say we're here to support the community, and we have a food pantry and all that. But I just heard in the last year since I've been there that there's a tree around the corner from us where there's the Florida Children's Methodist Home, and there's a tree there that was used for lynchings. And that has just grieved me, and I believe too that, I mean, when Cain murdered Abel, that his blood cried out from the land, and how can we be about praying healing in the community? And this, I hadn't heard about the EJI, the Equal Justice Initiative, so I want to hear more and look up the lynchings in my neighborhood and see how we might be able to go forward with more racial healing in our area.
Thank you, and I'll be happy to help in any way. Just be in touch with me, because I'm really committed. I think if we can name everybody who's been lynched in America, and somehow that would be an amazing thing. So, yeah, thank you. Yeah, others. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see your hand.
Well, I've heard all the conversations, and I pretty much come to the truth is I am a Black priest called by an all-white church, conservative in Melbourne Beach, Florida. And to see the other is just to see the people, and it was a unanimous call, and I had just graduated seminary. And to see the adjustment and the belief. People have said to me, are you sure? Are you sure? Will it work? But I'm having the best time of my life. But what was an example was 2 days ago, I had the first death in my parish. An old lady, 93 years old. She would come to church with her walker, but she didn't say much. But I spoke to her daughter yesterday, and she said, my mother said, make sure that I am the person who will take care of her funeral. And I'm only there 9 months. And there are little steps we see. It's not going to happen all overnight, but there are little steps. And I have seen this as a God call, and we as Christians have to take it, believe in it, and continue to work hard to see it grow.
Thank you. Yes, indeed. Yes, I appreciate that. I don't want to miss any hands. So, a half a shade braver. What do you have to do to be a half a shade braver? Yes. Jabril, go ahead.
I'm going to be a little braver myself. In the context of Pentecost, I think about this, and I wonder, because I've been told by folk, I'm always told how much more I need to learn because I'm still kind of young. I've been told by folk, it's not going to happen in your lifetime, it's not going to happen in your lifetime, it's not going to happen in your lifetime, it's not going to happen in your lifetime. And I wonder how much of that is something we just tell ourselves to give ourselves an excuse. Because when we look at Pentecost, the scripture was clear. Once the disciples got in alignment with the will of God, suddenly, out of nowhere, the Spirit rushes in like a mighty wind, and violent wind, and fills the whole place, and everyone in the place was able to proclaim the glory of God. Beloved community was created.
Amen.
And so I wonder, are we selling ourselves, are we selling the Spirit short? I'm not saying are we selling ourselves short. Are we selling the Spirit short when we continue the narrative that it isn't going to happen in our lifetime? Because no, pop culture may not have the answer. Pop culture won't have the answer. The church has the answer. Christ has the answer.
That's right.
And if we do what we need to do, I believe in my heart that if we do what we need to do to get in alignment with the will of God, then like that, we will see glory.
So how would you be a half a shade braver in that regard?
Well, because you're not familiar with the diocese, this is my half a shade braver. I'm the person that most people don't like to hear from. And so I get up at risk of having my head chopped off. And so I continue to get up and I tell people over and over again, it is easy for me to come and keep my head down and just pretend like I don't hear the microaggressions, like I don't see the stuff that goes on, and just stay in my lane and smile and say, okay.
Yeah.
But because I love, I got to risk being persona non grata and share the Spirit that's been given to me. So that's my half a shade prayer.
All right, thank you. Yes, sir. And what is your name?
I'm Jose Rodriguez.
Jose?
It's about not selling the Spirit short. I have so many conversations with people about Hispanic ministry. And I go to a place, they go into their pocket and say, it's not in my skill set, or I'm not called to do that, or not right now. The reality is diversity is here now, and I'm going to actually change me, Jabril. You're selling the Spirit short when you say it's not in my skill set. You're selling the Spirit short when you say, I'm not the person to do this. You are the person to do it if you're called, because you're a priest for God's whole church. And anyone can minister to any one person as empowered by the Holy Spirit. And that's one thing, for the sake of all our communities, I would like to hear is someone selling themselves short, someone selling the Holy Spirit short by saying, I'm not the person that can affect this change. Because all you have to do is be with one, thank you. You gave me those words, one accord with God, and the Spirit will rush in and do it for you. And we're not something, I hope our communities isn't something your church gets to choose to do.
Right.
I hope our communities is something that your church just serves because it's the right thing to do.
Yes, thank you. So one of the things we talked about a little bit on Sunday at church was just sometimes we don't, if we think about being empowered, to think about being empowered means that we have to do something. And so sometimes we run, all of us, any of us, run from being empowered because to be empowered then carries a responsibility. And it's easier to kind of be disempowered, to feel, to claim disempowerment so that we can do, we don't have to do that extraordinary thing out there. And a lot of, I don't know, I don't think about whether, like, should I do this or should I not? God's just given me some amazing courage, and I just keep on putting one foot in front of the other, and I keep on going down the road. When I started leading the dismantling racism work 6 years ago in the Diocese of Atlanta, we were this little commission that folks hadn't really heard of. I had heard of and didn't like, and they hated our training and pretty much tried to get out of it, though it was mandated for folks who wanted to be ordained. And in 6 years, we went from being that little group to being folks who now are in partnership with the presiding bishop running a Center for Racial Healing that is a resource for the entire church in 6 years. Because I kept on taking the next step and trusting that if we put our foot in the water, because we had taken our foot off the land and put our foot in the water, we'd find land again. And we had, thank God, Bishop Rob Wright, who was willing to go on that journey with us. And we went from we have our parishes that are doing more around this work, and people are trying to take more responsibility for the work themselves rather than waiting on a commission or a center to do the work. And it was all about having the faith to keep on going forward and the courage to keep on taking next steps and trusting that doors would open. So I don't know what all of your particulars are in this diocese, but I do know you've got wonderful resources and you can do whatever it is you need to do. And so much of what we need to do is to get clear about what we need to do, and then to get clear about what we will do. And I think that the lack of will affects us probably more than anything, both in individual ways and individual churches and also as a nation. Yes, sir.
I want to make kind of an endorsement. I'm the diocesan coordinator for Brotherhood of St. Andrew. Yeah. And I'm sure you're familiar with the 7 missions. And one, of course, is racial reconciliation. Mm-hmm. But after hearing you discuss reconciliation, I may tell the National Council we need to change it to racial.
I would love that. Racial healing implies getting ready to do the work. Racial reconciliation is almost like, okay, let's see if we can just figure out how we can go down this road together and be a little more civil to each other. And I think people mean well by it, but it's all the energy has been taken out of it, because it's too much of the time it has meant let's swap pulpits and choirs and let's meet for supper, and it hasn't meant let's do the hard work of undermining the racist structures and rebuilding something from the ground and creating a space where new life can be born. It hasn't meant that. And so healing implies that you're ready to do what it takes to get well. Do you want to be well? Jesus asking that man at the pool, do you want to be healed? And so we have to ask ourselves, do we want to get well? And then, okay, so if we want to get well, let's see what we have to do. And we start by making a new assertion that we want healing, because we're not going to get to reconciliation without healing, actually. I mean, it's not going to happen. We're going to get to some transactional stuff, but we're not going to get to reconciliation. We will get to reconciliation when we do healing. And we get to healing when we do the work inside and outside. It's not either or. You don't get to claim somebody's a contemplative or a mystic or whatever. We got to all do all the work. It's inner and outer work. It's in the church, it's out of the church. It's inside of us, it's outside of us. And we get to all do it. So I have Black friends who tell me, I don't want to talk about this anymore. I've been talking about it too long. Nothing's changed. I don't want to be bothered. You don't get to quit. You just don't get to quit. You're still alive. As long as you are alive, you get to do the work. And when you die, then you take it up with God. And God will decide what you get to do, But while you're here, you don't get to quit. Yes, ma'am.
Right. One phrase that you used very often today was interrogate yourself. Yeah. And it reminds me of what we're called to do on Ash Wednesday when we're preparing for self-examination. Mm-hmm. And I just think that is a very good thing to take on, to do, not just seasonally, but daily, interrogating myself. Right. And I thank you for that so much.
You are welcome. I love, that's a Bell Hooks word. I wish I had thought of it. But Bell Hooks, Bell Hooks wrote, a whole bunch of books, but she talks about it's self-interrogation, how important that is to do. And you can just look her name up somewhere and you'll find all of her books. But she's a great writer, has a lot to say about racial healing. Anybody else with a half a shade braver comment or a question or any? Yes, sir.
I love the Episcopal Church. I am blessed to have been a priest for over 50 years. One of the great resources that we have is the leadership of our bishop. And
he has taught me recently that God came not to save the church, but to save the world. And so we have a responsibility through our actions and through our words, but I would just remind us that it is the society that needs this message, not just us.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you're absolutely right. But until we get it straight for ourselves, we're not going to tell it to anybody else. So that's part of what I'm thinking, that it's like I'm not going to go out to cook dinner for the neighbors if I didn't feed my kids. So we need to get our house in order. So we have the will, the power, the capacity to go tell the story, and we can do that, and that's part of. So you're right. You're absolutely right. How do we witness? How do we bear witness to God's amazing grace in the world? And we can't do it until we understand that God's grace is amazing. And we lost some of that, and we've got to kind of get ourselves re-inspired, I guess, as a body of folks. So thank you. Anybody else? I don't want to. Yes, sir. I don't want to not hear whoever wants to be heard.
I didn't come having many expectations. Been to a lot of things over the years.
I understand.
Yeah. But I wanted to thank you because we speak out of what is inside us. And what is inside of you, it is a gift to us. It's not anger, but love. That comes across in everything you say, and I want to thank you for it.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a long journey to get to this space, as you might guess. Yeah. So I appreciate your bishop in this diocese because I think bishops have a lot to do with the tone of the work that gets done. So thank you, Bishop, for your support and care about this work. It's hard work. When I'm sitting here doing this, it doesn't feel like it's very hard, but when I get home tonight, I'll know that I worked hard today. So it catches up with you. So I want to close by reading the last two verses of the O'Donoghue poem as kind of our closing comment. So may my mind come alive today to the invisible geography that invites me to new frontiers, to break the dead shell of yesterdays, to risk being disturbed and changed. May I have the courage today to live the life that I would love, to postpone my dream no longer, but do at last what I came here for, and waste my heart on fear no more. And I will reread it and include us all. May our minds come alive today to the invisible geography that invites us to new frontiers, to break the dead shell of yesterdays, and to risk being disturbed and changed. May we have the courage today and every day to live the life that we would love, to postpone our dreams no longer, and to do at last what we came here for. And may we not waste our heart on fear no more. Amen. Amen. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. God bless you. Thank you.